All right, let's call this meeting to order. Welcome to the May 22nd, 2018 Multidisciplinary Advisory Committee meeting for the California Veterinary Medical Board. Like to have the roll call, please.
Absolutely. Dr. Klingborg.
Here.
Dr. Druces. Dr. Grant.
Here.
Dr. Pollard.
Here.
David Johnson.
Here.
Christy Pulaski.
Here.
Diana Hagel.
Here.
Jennifer Laredo.
Here.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Here.
All right, we do have a quorum. Agenda item number 2, committee chair's remarks, committee members' comments and introductions. This is the farewell tour for 4 of us here today: Diana Woodward Hagel, David Johnson, William Grant II, and myself will be terming out today. I'm going to give them an opportunity to say something as agenda item 6.5 after we've discussed their business and before public comments, and if they don't like the fact that I've added that agenda item, they can fire me. But I do need to say that I dropped the ball on 2035 duties of a supervising veterinarian that was supposed to be on this agenda. That was an issue that we had not resolved last time. We had language that went down to it was defeated in a 4-2 vote, and was supposed to bring back language at this meeting. It didn't get on the agenda. I didn't catch it when the agenda went out, and so at that point I couldn't put it on the agenda because of process. It is actually on the board's agenda for tomorrow, so tomorrow I will discuss with the board whether or not they want to discuss that. That's up to them, or want to send it back to MDC to work on. So we will do that and see whether or not it's going to boomerang back here or not, or if the board's going to tackle that tomorrow. Okay. Other committee members' comments? Okay. Introductions. Individuals in the audience, if you would like to introduce yourself, please do so now. Great. Thank you, everybody. Agenda item number 3, review and approval of the February 20th, 2018 committee meeting minutes. Yes, Jeff.
Correction, page 2, item 4, paragraph 1. Mr. Johnson is named. It should be Dr. Bill Grant.
Okay, other agenda items? I mean, minute corrections? Any meeting corrections from the audience? Okay, need a motion to accept the minutes? Second, anybody?
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second to accept the minutes. Any discussion from the committee? Discussion from the audience? Roll call vote, please.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Grant.
Abstain, not present.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
David Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulaski.
Abstain, not present.
Diana Hagel.
Abstain, not present.
Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
Dr. Sullivan.
Aye.
The motion does pass. Meeting minutes are approved. Agenda item number 4, election of the Multidisciplinary Advisory Committee Chair and Vice Chair. I would like to propose to this committee that we elect a chair at this meeting, and we allow the newly composed MDC at their next meeting to choose their own vice chair since 4 of us are terming out at this point. Okay. Are there any nominations for chair? Yes.
I have a question. Typically, the vice chair promotes to chair, and our vice chair isn't here.
That's-
Are we able to nominate him for chair without him physically being here today?
I don't know. I don't know what process is there.
Typically, the nominated person has to accept the nomination as part of the process.
Dr. Sullivan?
I would like to nominate Dr. Pollard for chair.
I'll second.
Dr. Pollard, do you accept the nomination?
I do.
Would you like to promise a chicken in every pot?
I won't.
Any other nominations for chair? Okay, hearing none, if we may vote on Dr. Pollard, Jeff Pollard, as the incoming chair of the MDC. That, you get the gavel after this meeting, Dr. Pollard, if you win. So I saw you eyeing it a minute ago. Yeah. Okay, we'll vote.
All right, I'll call for the vote. Dr. Klingborg.
Yes.
Dr. Grant.
Yes.
Dr. Pollard.
Yes.
David Johnson.
Yes.
Christy Pulowski.
Yes.
Diana Hagel. Jennifer Laredo.
Yes.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Yes.
Congratulations, Dr. Pollard. Agenda item number 5, update from the public and private shelters and minimum standards and protocols for Shelter Medicine Subcommittee. Let me turn to number 5. So this is, again, something that we've discussed over the last couple of years. We've been working on trying to put together language to address various shelter issues. And so there is an offering of language in here. It's really a distillation of the many discussions that we've had. It's not ready for prime time. It's not complete, but it's our task today to kind of work through this language and see what is something that we like or don't like, where are we missing things. And what we have under agenda item number 5 is we have on the first page a summary of the major items that have been put forward as things we should be addressing. And so we've got some from the SHAC, CACTA, and CVMA stakeholders meetings, and then we have a summary of the 8 major MDC subcommittee items. Then we have several pages of language that has been put together. And what you have here is not an attempt to create, at this point, a separate section for shelter. I think there's been wide discussion that that's the direction that we're going in, but it made the most sense to simply try and populate whatever that section is going to be with whatever language we already had existing, and then we could work with that, refine and revise. There are also some handouts that should be available in the back. We've got a handout from that's a CVMA work product that has a 2036.6 proposed language that would be duties of a veterinary assistant, and there's one other CVMA handout from the premises task force back there. So there's some loose handouts here today that we'll try and bring into the discussion as well. So what I thought we would do would be to simply start with this language, and I'm going to actually ask Dave Johnson if he's got anything he wants to chime in with at this stage, and then we're going to just kind of get to work.
Thank you, Dr. Klingberg. Also, thank you for bringing everything together. As the top line says, over the past 2 years, it's actually, I think, been longer than that we've been discussing, and a lot of ideas have been brought forth. Some of them have already, in principle, been adopted. I think this document tries to address as best we can some of the concerns raised by the stakeholders in this discussion. I think the main things that we looked at is the document does clarify that the animal shelters, if they are offering and housing animals that are owned by the public, do need to have a premise permit, that there needs to be a licensing manager. I think we addressed the issue of, in this document, of intake treatments under written protocols, which is a key concept for shelter medicine. I think that the duties of the attending veterinarian, as they're going to be discussed in the future, will tie over to this document also. I think that some of these issues have been defined. The euthanasia training, I think we're still waiting for some recommendations from the humane groups on the language they want there. It would be good to continue to define the rabies vaccination, even though that was a private conversation with the public health. Get that more specifically in writing, because after we're all gone, who's going to remember the private conversation? And then most certainly, I think in fleshing out this document more, there's still areas of sanitation and housing, as we discussed, better defining the registered veterinary technician versus the unregistered assistant in the animal shelter environment, simply because, as we've heard from testimony, many shelters don't have an RVT or may not even have a veterinarian. And then most certainly just moving forward and making the final decision whether all this needs to be in a separate section by itself or just this language dropped into the appropriate sections.
So again, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of this by section, and then we're going to begin the discussion. At the very first, what's called page 2 of 13 of the packet here, we have underlined language, and this would be new language that defines an animal shelter and defines some minimum standards. We have below that then licensee manager language, which is straight from the Practice Act. We have 2035 language, which is the outdated language. You do have a clean copy of the language as one of the handouts over there, because it's veterinary assistant and not unregistered assistant. There is also in this 2035 language, part of what we were discussing is 2035 at the last meeting, but was not approved. I just needed to put something in here as a placeholder. So that was there not as a final offering, but would be reflective of the whole 2035 discussion. And then you will see at the bottom of 2035, there is a discussion of rabies vaccines. 2035.5, the addition of the term veterinary assistant. I do not have the offered 2036.5 and 2036.6 language in here. That's my omission, but that is something that you have as present as a handout, which can be considered. And then we've got the 4840, medical records, euthanasia language. We've got the VACSP language, which does impact shelters, and then the euthanasia training, and then finally minimum standards for small and large animal premises based on the draft of what was just worked on and approved at our last MDC meeting. So those are the things that we felt were going to be a fundamental part of the skeleton of whatever this section of shelter medicine and the Practice Act was going to look like. So going back to the top of page, any questions at this stage, or otherwise we're going to go to the top of page 2 of 13 here. So we have offered language here. For the purposes of this section, an animal shelter is defined as any city and county animal care and control agency, public or private organization that contracts with the city or county to house animals and provides on-site veterinary services to those animals. An animal shelter that provides on-site veterinary services shall have a premises permit and a licensee manager as set forth in 2030.05, and the minimum standard shall conform to the small animal fixed facility or large animal fixed facility based on the species housed within the shelter. So that's proposed language. I think another thing that we had discussed at this meeting was at the previous meeting was a strong desire to do as much through regulation as possible and as little through statute at this point as possible. So the idea is that what we're crafting here, again, will be regulations, but I didn't put numbers to them. That's not our function here at the committee level. The staff gets to figure out where exactly that fits into the Practice Act. So, discussion point. David.
I just have a grammatical suggestion, and I think it's up to legal counsel, where we're talking about the minimum standards shall conform to the small animal fixed facility, and it says or large animal fixed facility. That should be and or just and, because then it's qualified based on species housed within the shelter. Some animal shelters, the ones I have worked at, do large and small animal. So they're going to have to comply to both those sets of standards. I think or implies that you're either one or the other. So it's just a grammatical change.
Other comments? I'm a little concerned that the term animal shelter, which is generically used elsewhere, and we're now using that same exact term, but we're using it in a different context, that may create some confusion. I don't know if we want to consider animal medical shelter or some other term so that we're defining it differently. The other thing is, this does narrow the focus as those shelters that are providing on-site veterinary services. And that there are certainly shelters that house animals that don't have a veterinarian on site. So is that within the comfort level and the vision of this committee or not? Yes, Diana.
Well, it's not within, I don't think I'm,
Oh, I think you are.
are you, am I? I don't,
There you are.
I have a problem with conflicting definitions in an already confusing Practice Act. So where else is animal shelter defined or used in the Practice Act?
Well, I don't know that it's used in the Practice Act. I mean, it's used in the Practice Act in a couple of places, but I was thinking about more where the regulatory bodies that are overlooking animal shelters. So,
Oh,
so that's where I was concerned.
other regulatory bodies.
Right, other regulatory bodies.
Like counties.
Right. USDA, I mean,
Right.
David, you're going to know more than I am
mean,
about
it's mentioned
this.
in food and ag codes and
Oh, boy.
public health codes, and so there is a lot of crossover.
And so maybe we want to continue to use that term, but we certainly are narrowing the focus purposefully.
I just have a concern that if it's defined differently, that it's a trap for the unwary. Because it's the basis, it's the foundation on which everything else rests, as to whether one has to comply or not.
Dick?
That part that is underlined,
Is your mic on, Dick?
Yeah.
Okay.
The part that's underlined, is this regs or statute? We don't have a number on this.
Right, it would be regulation. That was
Okay.
the thought.
So I thought that when you say for the purposes of this section, you're defining, this is the definition right here, not in another part of law or anything. So I think that clarifies, we're going to use that, this is the definition we're using just right here and no place else.
Or is used herein, I guess.
Bill?
What about considering getting rid of animal shelter? Because there have been a lot of, Orange County, for example, does not call it animal shelter anymore. It's an animal care facility. And you have a definition here, and it could be, for the purposes of this section, any city should be or county or county care and control agency. Really, the term animal shelter is sort of superfluous in this. If you have a definition, just go right to the definition. So again, it would be, for the purposes of this section, any city and/or county animal care and control agency, public or private, and just do it that way.
Yeah.
Something to consider.
That satisfies my concern.
Okay, I mean, it seems to work, yep.
No.
And so then in the second paragraph, that would be any city and county animal and care and control agency that provides on-site veterinary services. It is cumbersome, yeah.
You don't have to use the term animal shelter, you can come up with something else, but I don't think that every time you want to cite those conditions, you're going to have to spell it all out as a definition.
No.
You could say this section applies to any city and county animal care, et cetera.
Can you just put in, agency then? Can you just then shorten it and, hereafter agency or?
I would think so. So then we could just refer to it herein as the agency.
Right. And a lot of shelters, because it is a term that they're trying to get away from.
Right.
Because of some of the, negative connotations. Getting rid of animal shelter, I think, is something to be considered if we're changing this.
Okay. Like to bring in folks from the audience if anybody has any comments at this point.
Good morning, Erica Hughes, California Animal Welfare Association. Thank you. I think I have two comments about this proposed language. One is that we feel strongly that it should include humane societies and SPCAs that are incorporated under 10400 of the Corporations Code. These are, in California, long-established organizations that provide care to probably hundreds of thousands of animals in the state. And they should be able, for the good of the public and the welfare of animals, to perform basic procedures on intake. After all, this is what this is all about, is we're trying to find a way to meet the needs of the public and the animals. From our perspective, it just doesn't make sense to not include humane societies and SPCAs. That's my first comment. And then the second one is, my understanding was that the goal was to create a separate statute or regulation for minimum standards for shelters, and has that now been cast aside, or I guess I need clarity, because I know you said.
No, it's basically, rather than just, I basically did a cut and paste of existing language with the concept that it would be renumbered and be part of the shelter, but language.
So this is a placeholder, essentially.
This is a placeholder,
Okay.
yeah. These are the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle at this point. But,
Okay.
yeah.
And so I suppose I would just urge the committee, with respect to how animal shelter is defined, to consider whether it really does make sense to exclude humane societies and SPCAs, given the number of animals that they handle each year, and the important role that they play in the community, often as a supporting organization to their local animal care and control agency. I know there are many cities in which animal care and control is their budgets are so severely limited that the private organization in town on the weekend will pick up animals for them and bring them to them on Monday when they're open, and will kind of help with overflow. So this, as written, doesn't contemplate those situations.
I have a question for
Yes.
Erica. I have a question. As written, it says public or private organization. A humane society is a public or a private organization.
It says public or private organization that contracts with a city or county to house animals, and sometimes these arrangements aren't pursuant to contract, they're just informal agreements that the public and private shelters have with each other to help the public shelter meet the needs that it has.
So why,
Yeah.
what prevents them from contracting with them in order to fulfill this? If they're providing the service, what prevents them from contracting with them in order to provide this service?
So I'm thinking of one major California city where this happens, and I I won't say it on the record, but I know that it's an informal agreement between the two directors. This one shelter is really struggling. The private shelter has a lot of resources, and so they will fill in, on the weekend, they'll take in animals. If somebody surrenders an animal because the city shelter has extremely limited hours, the private shelter will take the animal in and hold the animal until the public shelter is open, so that, I don't even know if the public shelter has a drop box, but, assuming even they do, just so the animal doesn't have to be put in a drop box. And in that situation, it's from the perspective of the health of the animal and the public, it doesn't really make a difference that the animal is being taken into a public shelter rather than a private shelter.
But my question is, but what prevents a contract?
I don't know. I mean,
If they
it's
have
just-
an informal arrangement, what prevents that contract from being written up? If they're already doing the service, what prevents a contract from being done?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. And
Because then that would make it
then it
legitimate.
would put it under this thing. No, I mean, that's a question I need to go back to some of
Because it
the-
would be easily resolved if
I
they
see what you're
just
saying.
make a
Yeah.
contract between them. They're contracting with the city or county. So then they would be fulfilling this very easily. If they have an informal arrangement, then they just have to sign up a contract and they're fulfilling this, easily resolved.
Having never worked for a public agency, I don't know how easy it is for a department head to enter into a contract with a private organization, or whether that requires then.
But they already are.
Well, I understand, but like so we're talking, so I'm just I'm just trying to present you with the reality of what's going on and whether or not they're allowed to have this, informal agreement or not, and whether if it has to become formal, then, does it have to go through this whole bidding process? And, I don't know the answer to that question. I can find that out. I can ask these shelters that have these arrangements, these informal arrangements. whether they
Erica,
can do
one
it.
of the things to look at, in many instances, it doesn't have to be a formal bid contract, it can just be an MOU. And those are much easier to obtain between working organizations than a formal bid contract, and that, in a sense, is a form of a contract. I
So
think they
maybe
would-
if that's the case, then maybe we can change the language to say, instead of contract, maybe memorandum of agreement or just an
That would-
agreement or something, I don't know.
I think contract is fine. The other question I have the other question I have real quick, and again, you don't have to name the organization, but the Humane Society you're talking about, do they have a premise permit then?
This particular one does, but I don't know that that's, but.
You see, the whole
but
purpose
even
of
though they
this
have
is
a
to.
premise- But
Right. The whole purpose of this is to regulate the practice of veterinary medicine on the public's animals, regardless of who has those animals, whether they're a humane society or a city shelter or a county shelter or a private organization. If it's the public animals, that's what we're trying to regulate and protect.
So in this situation, they have a premises permit, but the veterinary assistant wouldn't be allowed to administer vaccines on intake because they wouldn't fall under that exception as an animal shelter because they're not an animal shelter as defined here. So that's my concern. That as long as the shelter has a premises permit, who cares if it's public or private or what? We just want a facility with a premises permit. And as long as it's a facility with a premises permit, even if it's a some random rescue, if it's a place with a premises permit, then why can't veterinary assistants perform those basic tests on intake? I don't see the rationale behind limiting it just to public shelters and private shelters that contract with public shelters.
Jennifer and then Bill.
Okay, so just in answer to the question of what would prevent them from having a contract, from what I've seen in the shelter industry, it's because that's just what they've always done and it wasn't required. So I agree with Christy that having a contract would have them fall under the purview of this, which maybe then we would have some oversight, which is what the point of this is. And the way I'm reading it, unless I'm wrong, the veterinary assistant would still be able to provide these services because they have a contract, unless somebody reads it differently. So I was more comfortable reading that they would have a premises permit because that would give us some oversight. But I'm reading it that veterinary assistants and RVTs both would be able to provide services because they would have a contract with these organizations. Does somebody else have a different?
Bill?
Yeah, I would agree. We are under contract with 3 cities and 1 county, And because we have hours that the county shelter is not open. And there was no bidding, it was a contract, they sent it. Here was how they're going to take care of the charges that we provide. And when we're not open, the emergency clinic is open, so we cover pretty much the whole day for a shelter. And there may be even times that the shelter's open that they don't have a veterinarian on premise, and those are cases that they'll bring too. So I don't think, at least in our experience, the contract has been an impediment to doing that. It's been pretty straightforward.
I have two comments. One is perhaps it's better to aim the regulation at the public's animals rather than the entity who's providing the care. Because isn't that the purpose? It's those instances where there's not a client owner. Those are the times that we're trying to get care quickly. That's one suggestion. But number two is I'm hearing a lot of this proposed regulation would give the board authority to enforce and provide oversight over these situations. If that's what we're all agreeing, then it needs to be in statute, because otherwise the board has no statutory authority. We would have to point to a statute that provides the board authority to regulate local agencies. And if it's unclear in statute, it needs to be made clear that way, not through regulation. Because otherwise, it won't go through the process. If OAL can't see that the board has statutory authority to regulate local entities in this way, the whole thing fails. And I think that it's probably easy enough to modify the premises permit statute to tweak this in public animal context, so that then, once we have the premises permit requirement and the board can oversee public agencies and the public's animals, then we could continue on with what that looks like in regulation as far as the facilities and the actual care that is provided in those circumstances.
Tara, because the whole purpose of this was to regulate the practice of veterinary medicine in a shelter setting, just like a large animal setting or a small animal setting. We're not trying to regulate how they do animal control work, because that's covered under Food and Ag and other resources there. We're not trying to tell them what impound fees are or anything of those natures. Those are all covered in other sections. We're dealing with the component of veterinary medicine that exists within these public or private shelters or humane societies. And it's a veterinary hospital within a larger system is basically how you look at it. And so I think you do have the authority, because you have the authority to regulate veterinary medicine.
Then why this language? Why are we specifically saying an animal shelter that provides on-site veterinary services shall have a premises permit? They should already have one then, according to the premises permit requirement statute.
Right, but we also know that through public testimony, there's literally, help me out, Erica, no one truly knows how many animal shelters do not have premise permits, because it's one of those things that just, it's not an enforcement issue, it's just it hasn't been clarified enough. The big agencies do, the big cities, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, they all have the premise permits. But I can tell you in the smaller areas of the outback of California, they probably don't yet. And so part of this is to bring those people into the fold and have a set of regulations that apply to them. My guess would be there are hundreds of animal shelters and humane societies out there that do not have premise permits, but nobody says anything.
Which, if we're reading the premises permit statute, they would already be in violation of the law. And
That is
this
correct.
language would be unnecessary, because this would just be a reiteration of existing statute.
True, but the other issue has been that shelter medicine is different than, in many ways, than the practice of veterinary medicine in a small animal practice or in a large animal practice. in many instances, there's not the same degree of supervision. They are unique medical situations that occur in higher volumes, and also you're in more of a public health preventative disease type of an environment as opposed to what you're experiencing in private veterinary practice. So the uniqueness of it pretty much requires that there be some special concerns outlined and guidance outlined in those categories. Because right now, they're just left to their own devices, and yes, when the inspectors come in, they've been trained, and they try their best. I've been through 3 inspections at 3 different facilities, and they try to apply existing regulations to a shelter environment, and it's a stretch sometimes.
And I think providing the limited circumstances for shelters and how that care is provided can be achieved in regulation. But from step 1, if you're saying with this language, you're creating the new obligation for a public agency to have a premises permit, it's either new and the board has no existing statutory authority, or this is just duplicative of the existing requirement. Either way, this language has to change. So you either add public animals to the premises permit requirement when veterinary care is applied, and then you go by regulation to specify the specific care that can be provided to public animals. Or you delete this language entirely because it's duplicative if we're going that direction, and then you just lay out what standards are required for public animal care.
Because I think that's the key, and I've brought that point up repeatedly, is we have humane societies throughout the state of California that do not do any animal control services. They do not take in the public's animals unless that animal is legally given to them and ownership is transferred. So they don't need a premise permit because they're not offering public services or veterinary services on public-owned animals. The animals they have in their care are their own animals. But then you go to the other side of the world and you have humane societies and city and county animal control agencies that are impounding stray animals that are technically, in the eyes of the law, owned by someone until their holding period is over, and veterinary services are being rendered to those animals. That's the section that that's the component that needs to be regulated.
Jennifer.
So I don't know if this is duplicative, I couldn't tell you, but from my standpoint, it's clarifying, because as somebody who works in shelter medicine, I can tell you how confusing it is. And when I'm trying to provide care that's in the best interest of an animal, I'm always worried, wondering if I'm following the law or not. So I'd like to find a way that maybe it's not so duplicative, but to not do away with this, because this does clarify and make it less confusing for people like me, and it's all about me.
I mean, there are times when the Practice Act is duplicative, when the small animal, large animal fixed premises, we do talk about, radiation safety or, the oxygen storage or whatever else. So there are times when the same words and sentences are in a different context, and this, to me, seems like it's another one of those times. Well, one quick question for Erica, and then Val will get to you. And that was, do you have any thoughts on this conversation we've had about removing the phrase animal shelter and going to agency? Do you think that the phrase animal shelter needs to be in this document specifically?
I think the term animal shelter is fine. What agencies are trying to get away from is the term animal control. And so they often pair it with care, or they just take the control out completely. I have not heard that animal shelter as a term is offensive to people.
Yes, Bill.
One thing, too, is, not to throw a monkey in the wrench, but not all of these animals are public animals. There's a percentage that are privately owned that people are unaware of at the time of impounding. And so it's not just public animals. A lot of control from the cities are on private-owned animals.
Val?
Valerie Fenstermaker, CVMA. We've had this debate for a lot of years, and I think we still continue to disagree with Erica, respectfully, and agree a lot of what Dave Johnson is saying. There is a big difference between a government contracted agency over in a shelter environment, whether it's public or private, or the multitude of different types of private entities that are out there, from the very smallest to large ones to rescue groups to all types of entities that do not have government contracts. And it took me 10 minutes to find this section back there, but there was a statute passed, a law passed a couple years ago due to the Veterinary Medical Board's inspection authority over a private shelters, I'll call them shelters that do not have a contract, a government contract. And so in 4809.5, the Veterinary Medical Board does not have authority to go in and inspect any private shelter that does not have, if I remember this correctly, that is not have a premises permit with the board unless there is an unlicensed activity complaint against that shelter. So that investigative authority does not, the VMB doesn't have that. And that was a pretty big deal at the time, because it took, it clarified, I think, in some ways that you had to have a premises permit in order to have that authority to go in and inspect these shelters, whether they were private or public. So I think that needs to be looked at, and I personally, from our perspective, I know animal shelter is kind of a large term, but it isn't a term that everybody recognizes. And from the perspective of what we're trying to do in the Practice Act, and that is to carve out something that is recognizable for animal shelters, for those types of facilities, I think to just take that out would be potentially unclear for anybody who's trying to navigate the Practice Act and say, wow, here's a section on animal shelters. Now I know what I'm reading and what applies to a shelter that's contracted with by the government. So those are just my overall comments at this point, and I would ask Tara to look at that section also, because I think it could have some impact here. Thank you.
Comments? Sorry, Val, but I guess I need you to be more explicit about this Humane Society, why CVMA doesn't want this language, the Humane Society and SPCA's incorporated. To paraphrase, it's just there's so many different entities that encompasses, that defining them, or is it about the kind of animal that's in them?
I think a lot of them are unregulated, and I think that's a problem, whereas if they do have a contract with a government agency, there are requirements. We, in our experience, have seen, and even in our conversations with at that time, SHAC and CACTA, there were a number of comments about a bit of the Wild West out there, and I think that needs to be looked at when you're talking about regulations.
What we're proposing here, though, is that private shelters be included in the definition and therefore be subject to a premises permit and then be subject to regulation by the VMB. I don't see how that's problematic. I think that increases the protection to animals. Whereas if you exclude them from here, then they stay off on their own in the wild, wild west, and the VMB doesn't have any regulatory authority over them. It seems to me that if the rescue or the private shelter has a premises permit, then the concerns of the VMB are satisfied because they have the ability to inspect. And so, to me, it's, there has been a lot of debate back and forth about whether or not private shelters need premises permits or not, or whether they're the owners of the animal and therefore fall under the owner exemption. I think including them here would clarify that in a way that I think would be, I'm assuming that CVMA would like, that it would clarify that they are not, they don't fall under the owner exemption, but that they would need a premises permit. In an exchange for that, they would be granted the limited or extra authority to administer, perform basic tasks on intake, which to me is a modest give for what the VMB gets in exchange, which is regulatory oversight over these facilities, these rescues that are performing veterinary care.
Christy?
Well, I just have huge concerns about opening up to rescues and all of these things that are just, we can't control that many. I just think that that's an area we just can't go to. And I think that we, yes, would it be nice to be able to have that great area of expansion, but we can't do that. And we're opening ourselves up to allowing too many things to happen that I don't even think that we have any idea to know what that would do. By opening that, I don't know that we know the ramifications of that. And so I don't think that whatever needs to be, I think a contract resolves that. If they're contracting with the city or county, I think it resolves the issue.
Okay. Yes, Diana?
Kind of keying off Christie's comment, has the board ever considered drafting suggested county ordinances for counties and localities?
No, not that I'm aware of, sorry.
All right.
No,
I'm just throwing it out.
Yeah.
Because I think what her comment implies is that it's best, these smaller groups, which may spring up and then go away, are best left regulated by local authorities. But they may not have the resources or the expertise to know what the problems are. Just throwing it out.
I think potentially that would be difficult for the board to do because the board would have to then take a look at all of the other statutory requirements sitting under the Health and Safety Code and the Penal Code and Food and Ag, wherever all of this stuff is, because, we don't know what's appropriate for each local scenario. I don't think we would be drafting local ordinances as much as perhaps spelling out best practices, which would just be then posted online. Under the facts, we've got the FAQ section on the website. We refer to all the oversight agencies of animal shelters. But yeah, and otherwise, it wouldn't be helpful to try and figure out all the different counties and scenarios locally to try and come up with local ordinances, but also, I think you guys have enough on your plate in every other instance.
Let me jump in here. Is there any indication that there's any local oversight of these groups that we're talking about? Small groups?
Not unless they have a contract. I see us going around in this circle, non-ending circle, of saying, if you're doing these intake protocols, you're practicing veterinary medicine, you need a premises permit. If you're a small agency, group out there on your own, and you're doing these, you still need a premises permit. So it's just this vicious cycle. How do you get them in the loop? Well, I think that's our job. If there's a group out there that does not have a premises permit, that's acting on their own without a contract with the county, then I think it is our job under 4809.5 that we investigate them because they're doing veterinary medicine without a premises permit. They're acting as they need a premises permit. So I think it's then our job to enforce what is there. That's how they get into line. I don't know if we need to have special, I mean, we do need regulations written to spell out what shelter medicine does and can do, but I just see us going in the circle, and I don't think it's, I don't think we're addressing the issue. I think it's our job to address the issue.
Well, then 4809.5 is not meeting your concerns.
It does.
Because it doesn't deal with premises that were never registered. It doesn't deal with an inspection of premises that
Says
were
you
never.
cannot inspect unless there's unlicensed activity. So if they're doing this intake procedures, which is the practice of veterinary medicine without a premises permit, they're not, we can go in and inspect them and cite them.
I don't
So
think that's what 4809.5 says.
Okay,
It prohibits, actually stated another way, it prohibits inspections.
unless there's unlicensed activity. And if they don't have a premises permit and they're doing intake protocol,
No, it says you can inspect premises if there's unlicensed activity, if the registration is lapsed or is delinquent, which implies that there was once a registration. Those entities that were never registered are not covered by 4809.5, and maybe that's what needs to be addressed.
Nothing in this section shall be construed to affect the board's ability to investigate alleged unlicensed activity or to
Oh.
inspect a premises for which registration is lapsed or is delinquent.
Oh, okay,
Okay.
got it. All right.
Nancy?
Well, two things. If you want to go ahead and.
Nancy, will you identify yourself,
Nancy
please?
Early, California RVT Association. I would suggest that if you want to go ahead and include all the animal shelters, including ones that are not contracted with a city or agency, you just change this sentence as defined as any animal care or control agency or public-private organization that houses animals and provides on-site veterinary services to those animals. So that would be simple enough. But beyond that, I wanted to comment on 4840, which authorizes services by technicians and assistants. And the A says that RVTs and veterinary assistants are approved to perform animal care services prescribed by law under supervision. But B says RVTs may perform animal health care services on animals impounded by a state, county, blah, 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 according to written direct order. It doesn't say that veterinary assistants may do that. So I don't think that you can write a regulation that allows veterinary assistants to perform services that the statute doesn't.
So we already agreed to change and add veterinary assistant.
Is 4840B, is there language to change that? Didn't we?
Yeah, we already agreed on that.
Yeah. I thought that was language moving forward, Nancy.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you would need to do that,
Yeah.
that authority,
Yeah.
if you were planning to allow
Okay.
veterinary assistants to perform these services.
Okay. So we're kind of on this first paragraph here. We've had some discussion about the definition of an animal shelter and whether or not we want to use the term animal shelter or maybe try and use the term agency. We've had some discussions about the scope of this. Is it as written here, or does it include humane societies and SPCAs that are incorporated under such and such code? Also, private shelters and whether or not they need permits, or whether or not this is narrowed to public animals. So those are kind of different bullet points. I actually want to just keep moving the conversation forward at this stage and move to the second paragraph for a minute and talk about the fact that this language that's offered narrows the scope of this section to only those facilities that are providing on-site veterinary services. So we had to draw a line somewhere, because certainly there are many animal shelters that are housing animals that need veterinary care, but they are getting that care is being given off-site, and we chose for the purposes of this section to restrict it to on-site. Is there any issue with that? Does that make sense, or? Okay. And then when we look at minimum standards, so now I'm on to paragraph 3. When we look at minimum standards, again, the sense here from the subcommittee was that we were going to use the small animal fixed and large animal fixed facility minimum standards as the template, recognizing that there are some things like exam rooms and whatnot that we may want to strike out. But the committee did not go through and narrow that at this point, simply wanted to use that as a placeholder so we understood that these minimum standards were going to look largely similar to those that have already been approved by the board.
I have a comment.
Yeah, yes.
What is the authority for the premise permit? And should that not be in there?
It's Business and Professions Code 4853.
Yes. Shouldn't that be in there?
Shouldn't that be in this proposed language?
Yes.
In the middle paragraph, it says if they're providing on-site veterinary services, they shall have a premises permit and a licensee manager.
You've mentioned the regulation as opposed to, in regard to licensee manager, but not in regard to premise permit.
She
Wouldn't it
wants to
clarify
reference that
things
code.
if you put it right there as well?
So we do, so in that second paragraph there, Diana, an animal shelter that provides on-site veterinary services shall have a premises permit and a licensee manager.
She wants to reference the code.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right there,
Oh, okay.
since you're referencing licensee manager.
Sure.
And even though it's redundant, there it is.
That'll also have to be included in your authority and reference citations. But again, I think this is duplicative language if we think that 4853 already provides authority for the board to enforce this, because 4853 requires all premises where veterinary medicine, dentistry, and surgery and the various branches thereof is being practiced.
I know it's duplicative, but it just seems to me that the Practice Act is difficult for the layperson to read and understand quickly. And I think this, clarifies it.
So Tara, would you be more comfortable if we simply reference in somewhere in these first three paragraphs 4853 and say, here's the authority? I mean, I get that you're saying this is not necessary, and yet what we've heard from the sheltering community is that we need to have some guidance in the Practice Act for them, and some of that may begin with the authority, but then we need to flesh out minimum standards and all those different pieces.
My recommendation would be to change the statute first to clarify for everyone that public animals or animals that are impounded or deposited at a facility, the facility needs to obtain a premises permit. And I think that's best in statute, and then everything else flows from there, because you've specifically given the board authority to enforce every other regulation that will craft exemptions for these specific scenarios that no other facility will be able to utilize.
May we discuss that concept now, or does that need to be agendized for another meeting?
Well, this beginning paragraph has no regulation or statute number attached to it, so I believe that we could absolutely discuss putting that in statute. I do have some language that I drafted to tweak the statute itself. If you want to take a look at that, maybe we could take a 5-minute break and distribute copies of the suggested language to everyone for your consideration.
Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break.
Changes she just said.
All right, we're going to call the meeting back to order.
That's interesting.
We are on agenda item number 5, discussing shelter minimum standards and premises permits. We do have some language in front of us here. Tara, will you please introduce this language?
Okay, so the language before us is revising Business and Professions Code Section 4853 to provide for animal control shelters, and would revise subdivision B to add after shall include, so it would read premises for the purpose of this chapter shall include an animal control shelter. That would be the only addition to subdivision B. Then under subdivision C, that would move down to new subdivision D, and inserted to C would be animal control shelter for the purpose of this chapter shall mean a facility where animals are deposited with or impounded by a state, county, city, or city and county agency or its agents. I did want to make a note that I used animal control shelter because that is the same term as found in Business and Professions Code Section 4840B. That's RVT VA tasks. And I was trying to make this broad enough to incorporate, I mean, this is, as the other proposed regulation is aimed at local agencies and also those acting on the agency's behalf. So it gets us out of the contract or agreement situation, and just when those private organizations are acting on the public agency's behalf, that for the purposes of requiring the premises permit would need the permit, and it would be an animal control shelter. I do want to raise an issue, though. Dr. Sullivan and I were talking about the broader issue, which is potentially the problem is providing for the public's animals. So these are scenarios where we don't have a veterinarian client-patient relationship, which is typically required to provide veterinary services. So when we're talking about those animals who've been found and then impounded or deposited with a facility, it's those scenarios where we're trying to craft an exemption for RVTs, VAs, and permit holders to administer intake services. So would it be helpful to move away from this shelter situation to instead craft a regulation to provide RVT, VA, and permit holder healthcare tasks in accordance with Business and Professions Code Section 4836, which requires the board to establish animal health care tasks that may be performed by RVTs and VAs, and then aim it at those public animals that are impounded or deposited with a facility. And that would be the touchstone for providing a list of animal health care tasks that could be performed upon intake only for the public animals. So perhaps that would be a scenario which moves us out of the statute realm back to regulation, and then also getting us out of the local agency versus private shelter problem.
Okay. Dr. Sullivan.
My thinking is, and our discussion was related to, this scenario also happens in private practice. If we're closed from 12 to 2, as far as veterinarians being on staff there, and somebody brings in an injured animal they found, there's a situation where under a phone call or a protocol, our technician or our veterinary assistant could do the intake on that animal and treat it according to the symptoms and have the same rules as a shelter would have. And then we don't have to get into exemptions for shelter, because I think the scenario is there in private practice also.
Discussion? Yes.
Not to further cloud the issue, but Tara, one of the groups of animals in the animal shelter community that we have to deal with that we've brought up before. There are animals that are seized from the public under the humane laws. And you're going to have to make sure we're writing language. You're not going to have a doctor-client-patient relationship with these people because the law says you have to treat those animals. You're not going to be in contact with these people to get permission to treat their animal because you seized it from them and they're going to be prosecuted usually for animal cruelty. So we just need to be careful. Right now, we're just talking about impounded animals, but technically an animal can be impounded under a humane seizure. You could impound 20 dogs that all need veterinary care. You know where the owner is because you took them out of their backyard, but you're not going to establish a valid doctor-client-patient relationship because it's a legal case. And they're not going to have any say, usually, in the treatment of their animals. The shelter or the Humane Society is going to provide that care.
I think that would be easy enough to write in for the impounded, deposited, or animals seized by.
Right, and I brought that point up earlier, and we did include that language somewhere. I just didn't want it to get lost.
Isn't that covered under penal code?
True, but the penal code says you have to provide the veterinary care, but the Veterinary Practice Act says you can't provide veterinary care without a doctor-client-patient relationship, so there's a
No,
conflict.
I think the penal code overrides that
Well,
one.
no, I would think the penal code trumps the Practice Act in that one, but I think it'd be nice to have it clarified.
And you know that you get the public weighing in on that one at time. It's not a pleasant situation as we had with the rabbits not too long ago.
So I'm actually looking at the penal code, section 597.1, subdivision F, discusses an officer authorized under this section seizing or impounding an animal based on a reasonable belief that prompt action is required to protect the health or safety of the animal or the health or safety of others. Potentially, we could reference that code section. So,
Right.
we don't need to keep adding more and more words to our regulations, but, for those seizure situations, we could just reference.
Right.
So, Tara, basically, this language that you've offered in 4853 B and C would serve in lieu of the language that's the first paragraph of what we have identified or presented in this packet. Is that?
Correct.
Okay.
Just the language on page 2 of 13 up at the top, all underlined.
Okay. Any other discussion by the committee on that language, this 4853 language? Okay. Yes, Dick.
I like it, but just reading it, sometimes it does at least takes me a while to,
Yeah.
go over it, so.
We're not going to vote on it this,
Okay.
we're going to let it just kind of digest for a little
Okay,
bit
good.
while we kind of continue to talk about this.
I do like it. I
Okay.
do like it.
Comments from the audience at this point on this language? Again, we're not putting anything up for a vote at this stage. We're just trying to have a discussion about this as we try and do a couple of things here. And one is, of course, establish the need for the premises permit, or at least clarify the need for the premises permit. But then the other thing is to try and define what that shelter premises looks like and what are the various elements of that. Yes, Christie?
Well, I'm just going to say that I have some concerns about not voting on some things since we're going to have a whole new committee when this committee is familiar with it. So I'm
Well, I
just,
didn't say we weren't voting on it today, just not this instant,
okay.
okay? Yeah.
It just stressed me out for a moment.
Yes, yeah. We're not here to just chat, but we're going to try and move some things forward.
Stressed me out for a moment.
Yeah.
I also wanted to add something, if it's not clear with this language, that even though I'm just adding a new subdivision C to define what animal control shelter is, this does fall under, I mean, it links up to premises, which is defined, and animal control shelter would be included. And it's those, under subdivision A, those premises where veterinary medicine is being practiced as it relates to an animal control shelter. That would be the only scenario that the premises permit would be required. So I just want to make clear that not every single animal control shelter would have to get a premises permit. It's only those instances where veterinary medicine is practiced.
So in other words, on-site, the second paragraph where we
Yep.
talk about on-site.
Right.
Okay. Dr. Pulowski.
Ken Pulowski, CVMA. Just wondering, at the end of paragraph C, it's agents. What is an agent? Is that a contract or is that an informal agreement?
I would argue that that would be anyone acting on the agency's, the local public agency's behalf. So it could be just the individual who's picking up the animal control officer, but not really, because what we're talking about in this section is the facility that needs to be permitted. So those instances where an organization is acting on the public agency's behalf, has a facility where they're providing veterinary care services to impounded, deposited, or seized animals, they would need the permit.
So that could apply to agencies with an informal agreement versus an actual contract.
Yeah, if the public believes that the individual is acting on the local public agency's behalf, they would be covered.
Yes, Dick.
So, again, we're talking about statute change, so we would want to make sure that all stakeholders are in 100% agreement so that it would go through like an omnibus bill. So, got to be sure.
So,
Do the stakeholders that are present have any input at this time?
wait, I have a question.
Yes.
So to clarify what he just asked, so the agent, that means that the private entities that have an informal agreement don't need a contract, they're covered, then it doesn't need to be a contract, they don't need their own veterinary premises permit because they're acting on behalf, they can perform.
Yes, if they are,
So they can perform veterinary services on their site without a premises permit because they're an
No.
agent.
no, and that's the whole point. If you're an agent of a local agency, and you're operating a facility where the animals are deposited or impounded, that's covered under the definition of animal control shelter, which is part of premises that has to be permitted if veterinary medicine is being practiced. So if there is no specific contract, but rather an agreement, or even the local agency is depositing these animals with an organization at a facility for the purposes of caring for the animal when there's, the owner isn't known or the owner is dangerous, they would have to have a premises permit to provide veterinary care, which then gets us into the carve-out language in the regulations to authorize the RVTs and VAs and permit holders to provide limited intake care to the public's animals.
So, but did we just, if by doing this though, if they have a contract, a written contract, then they wouldn't even need a premises permit?
Still need.
They would be considered an agent, whether they had a contract or just a verbal agreement. If they're acting on behalf
Right.
of the public agency to care for these animals, they would need the premises permit.
Erica.
Hi. So to clarify, if you are an animal shelter that doesn't meet the definition here of a quote-unquote animal control shelter, you are then not required to be registered with the board?
If you're not providing veterinary services under A at a premises, you would not have to be permitted.
So what's the point so you're including animal control in here in order to just clarify that they're included even though you take the position that they're already included even without this language?
I'm saying that it's, the statute itself needs to be clarified because there's enough confusion among shelters and the public and practitioners whether or not an animal control shelter or animal shelter has to be permitted when providing veterinary services.
So if I were an SPCA or Humane Society and I read this language, I think that I could come to the conclusion that because I'm not an animal control shelter as defined, I've been specifically excluded from the requirement of obtaining a premises permit, from the definition of premises. Because premises shall include an animal control shelter, and then animal control shelter is narrowly defined.
Right.
And so if I don't fall within that definition, then the legislature didn't intend to include me within the definition of premises.
And you're not providing veterinary services, then you would not fall under the board's purview. What do you see wrong with that? Like, are there
I see that
scenarios?
if I specifically calling out a public animal control agency, it can be interpreted as specifically excluding a private shelter. And I guess I'm going back to, it seemed to me that the point of this conversation when it started years ago was how are we going to make sure that animals in shelters are getting the care that they need when they're impounded, and that they are, and they get the care while the shelter is being in compliance, and the people in the shelter are being in compliance with the law. And so, and that's why we're going into these definitions and these clarifications. It brings me back to the point that as long as a shelter has a premises permit and it's being regulated by the board, the shelter staff, RVTs and the veterinary assistants should be allowed to perform these basic tasks. I mean, that's kind of where we all started here. And I feel like we're digressing.
No, I just wanted to point out that my language was modeled after the underlined language on page 2 in that first paragraph, where it's just defining animal shelter as any city, county, animal care and control agency, public or private organization that contracts with, that's an agent. So I also, maintaining this limitation, used the same limitation in the proposed statute. So, this is limited to exclude private organizations who don't operate on behalf of the public agency.
So I guess my question is, why don't you also want to clarify that private agencies that perform veterinary care on animals need a premises permit, one, and then if they do, then they're entitled to the privileges in 4840B, which allow veterinary, as amended, proposed to be amended, that veterinary assistants and RVTs in those practices in those organizations are allowed to perform the basic tasks via telephonic, written, or direct order.
So,
I thought that's where we were trying to go.
well, that's not what this original language says on page 2. It's very limited to the agent scenario. But if the committee is interested in expanding that to private organizations not providing care on behalf of a local agency, we can do that. Or, I think the statute needs clarification one way or the other because shelters aren't clear. However, I don't think we have to have it if we just want to continue with authorizing RVTs, VAs, permit holders to provide intake care to the public's animals. I think we could do that in one regulation that just specifies the health care tasks they can perform under written orders, and then link it to that the board shall come up with the health care tasks that these practitioners can perform. I think big picture, we need a statute change. We need to clarify the animal shelter situation. If everyone's willing, opening it up to the private organizations, I think, is appropriate because the whole point is protecting the animal. So why would we carve the private organizations out who are, specifically, if they're a shelter, we're saying right now, and they're providing veterinary care services, they have to have a permit. If we're trying to clarify everybody who has to get one, they should be included.
Yes, and so that's where we're coming from. We're not saying that the private shelter shouldn't have a premises permit. We're saying that if they're performing veterinary medicine, they should have a premises permit. And if they have a premises permit, then they should be able to perform the basic healthcare tests on intake that public shelters are able to perform as well. And we feel like there's sufficient protection to the public and to the animals because there is oversight by the VMB.
Okay, Dave?
Erica, would you agree that there are humane societies in California that do not take in any stray animals?
Yes.
Okay. And that they do not provide any public veterinary services? In other words, they're not running a vaccination clinic, they're not running a spay-neuter clinic, they're not providing any veterinary services for a fee to the public?
Yes.
So those people don't fall under the purview of the board because there's no public animals coming in, there's no stray animals coming in, they're a private organization.
So if I'm a shelter, a private shelter, and I go to my city shelter and I pull an animal and I bring it back to my private shelter and I administer vaccines, am I practicing veterinary medicine?
No, because you legally obtained that animal.
So that's an owned animal and I'm not required to, I can practice
It's
those.
not my decision to make that
I mean, if the
leap,
VMB is taking that position, then.
But it is. I have a humane society in San Diego County that provides no services whatsoever to the public. They don't run vaccination clinics. They don't run spay-neuter clinics. They do not take in stray animals. They do not provide emergency care. They adopt out animals. People bring them animals and legally give them their animals. They have a veterinarian on staff that spays and neuters them, and these animals are put up for adoption. That doesn't fall under the veterinary board. I know we've argued this one back and forth, but they're not providing a service to the public-owned animals. But the second Humane Society takes in a stray animal, that animal could be an owned animal, then it is providing care. Even if it's a vaccination, it is providing care to a publicly owned animal. If it's a humane society that goes out and does humane investigations and seizes animals, they're bringing in the public's animals and are practicing veterinary medicine on them and are going to need a premise permit. So yes, there are a whole bunch of humane societies out there that don't need a premise permit as long as they're not providing some service for a fee to the public. They can do humane education, they can do show and tells, they can have therapy pet programs and things of that nature, but as long as they're not offering for a fee, I don't really see where they fall under the board's authority or even responsibility, because it's their animals.
So even when they're administering vaccines, they're not
It's no
practicing
different than
veterinary
me
medicine?
vaccinating my own animal. I own it.
So then, would you extend that argument to animals once the holding period has run in a public shelter?
Well, that one has never been decided, and my belief is that is true.
Okay.
Because the argument is if I have legal authority to dispose of something, either via adoption or humane or euthanasia, then I should be the owner of it. But that's an argument for another day among legal people, and it's never been decided to the best of my knowledge. But like I said, there's a lot of private humane societies out there that do not offer services. But I will give you another example that I can talk about because it is public knowledge and has been in the newspapers and it's all legal, is San Diego Humane Society is going to take over the animal control services for the city of San Diego. The San Diego Humane Society agency that's taking it over doesn't need a premise permit right now because they're not doing animal control. The second they move into that building, and assume all the responsibilities for the city of San Diego and start taking in all these stray animals, they're going to have to get a premise permit for that building because they're practicing veterinary medicine on the stray animals for the city of San Diego.
So is this an official VMB position, or is this?
I'm just
I mean,
giving you my
I'm-
opinion, okay? You can talk to legal counsel and the veterinary board. That is just how I see the shelter community. I think we're getting ourselves all confused by trying to define whether you're a humane society or an animal shelter. It's what you're doing to the animals that are coming in. Are they a stray animal, and who is the owner of those animals?
So I think we're comfortable with this language, if in fact your, what your
I like
interpretation
Tara's
was.
language. I
is-
think she's helped clarify
If we're all on the same page
what
with
needs
that,
to
but
be
I don't.
done. But I'm one member of this committee, and I'm done after today.
Good questions, good points. Discussion from the committee? Yes. So again, we've got some language here, this 4853 language, and as we continue to kind of get back into our packet, that language really would eliminate the need or replace in some way the first two paragraphs of this, because again, once you have a premises, then you also need to have a licensee manager. Right? Okay. So then the third paragraph, as we just continue to try and move through this, so we're going to certainly at some point break for lunch, and we're going to come back, and we'll have time to have absorbed this and hopefully digested lunch as well. So we'll spend a little bit of time kicking this around before we put anything to a vote. But then the third paragraph here is about minimum standards, and is there some consensus that those minimum standards would closely reflect the minimum standards set forth for small animal fixed and large animal facilities? Okay. I'm going to, then the next section is 2030.05, and that's licensee manager. There was purposefully no distinction drawn between the requirements for a licensee manager in a shelter setting versus a licensee manager for any other premises. So the language is identical to that for every other veterinary premises.
I'm bothered by the use of premise permits and permitting because it's nowhere in the code. It's registration. I can't find the word permit anyplace. And that was why I kind of raised that first premise permit. The reader is going to say, okay, I need a premise permit. I go to the index, and I don't find it. In fact, registration is hard to find. But you scrutinize. I kind of challenge you to scrutinize the 4800 series, and I don't think you'll find the word permit anyplace. It's registration. And I think by injecting the word permit, and even by using it here, we're misleading the public. Yes, sir. Oh.
Dick, yeah.
Well, I don't think every practice or every discipline have premises permits. I think it's somewhat unique to veterinary medicine.
It's just not in the code.
Well,
It's registration.
Yeah, I think that's actually more of a minor change that we could make throughout the regulations to change premises permit to premises registration.
Registration, right.
Okay. So we've got, again, 2030.05 licensee manager language, and then we start to get into the conversation of supervision. We've got 2035, and I'll ask you with section A1, which is some proposed language that we've not finalized or discussed, to just kind of put a big question mark there. And then we had some language in 2035D, which was offered about rabies vaccines. And the suggestion that came out of the last meeting was that we actually create the language and then we offer it to Department of Public Health and other entities to comment on it. And that is how, if we're going to make a change or clarify how and whom may give a rabies vaccine, that is the best process for doing that. Rather than looking for a letter or some endorsement, We create it, and then we send it there and say, what do you guys think? So my question is, what do you guys think about D? Dick?
We're on D, right?
Yep.
Well, again, I hate having different regulations for different entities. And I would say, also in this case, what's the difference between an animal shelter and a private practice? Why wouldn't we have the same rules? So if a client comes in again at noon and everybody's out to lunch and they want a rabies vaccine and they forgot to tell us when they brought the animal in to board and it's ready to go out the door, why wouldn't we have the same ability to authorize by phone or protocol to give a VA or RVT to give that rabies vaccine before the client takes it home? So I would like to have this clarified, but as a general rule across the board, not just for shelters.
So would you offer language that rabies vaccines may be administered to an animal and strike owned and upon redemption to an animal shelter, and say rabies vaccines may be administered to an animal upon or pursuant to the direct order, written order, or telephonic order of a veterinarian?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
And I would support you wholeheartedly. I've thought that for years. And just to remind everyone, when this started, this was prefaced as, this is an access to service issue. So in other words, we're making a service available to the public, and Marie said, those are very defensible. That is something, not just creating regulations to benefit veterinary medicine, but creating a regulation to benefit the public and access to services in some of these outlying areas. And most certainly, you have the public health argument that the more animals that are vaccinated, the greater the public is protected. And so most certainly, if you want to add in private veterinary practices, I think the private practices would be very happy.
Okay. Yes, Nancy.
Is there currently a statute or regulation preventing a rabies vaccination from being given? Because right now, a registered veterinary technician or a veterinary assistant are allowed to administer treatments on the.
It has to do with the examination part of it, Nancy, the examination prior to administering the
Yes,
vaccine.
but this is an animal who's leaving the shelter.
Right, and it may not have been seen by a veterinarian.
Okay, so that's the problem.
Right, and that
So
was
that's what you need to say.
Right, but that's-
Rabies vaccination may be administered without a prior examination by a veterinarian.
Right. And that's what the people that came and made the public comments were saying. Every shelter in California does it differently. If you show up at Friday to claim your animal and the veterinarian's gone home, some shelters say, come back on Monday. And so now that animal is in the shelter for 2 more days. Other shelters I know of just go ahead, the veterinarian's not here. Oh, well, we're going to give the rabies vaccine. We want the
But
dog
it's
out
not
the
in
door.
The
here.
point that Dr. Sullivan brought up would be irrelevant then, because the animals in your hospital are all examined by, the reason they were in the hospital was to be examined by the veterinarian.
Not if they're boarding.
Yeah.
You talked
But
about
there's
the
nothing
boarding.
in here that states there's no prior examination or VCPR.
Right, so, I mean, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, you need to state that, because this is not at all clear, because right now, they can give it.
Yeah,
rabies
the
vaccine.
2 issues were no prior exam and the veterinarian was not on the premise. Those were the 2
Well, they don't need to
issues.
be on the premises now,
Correct.
so we need to deal with the prior exam.
So there was some discussion with 2035D that we would make some deletions from the language such that it would read, rabies vaccines may be administered to an animal an animal pursuant to the direct order, written order, or telephonic order of a veterinarian licensed or authorized to practice in this state. I can't hear you.
I would say you have to add without a prior examination, because everywhere else in the Practice Act it's required.
So the comment was, do we need to state without a prior examination here?
I don't know that I disagree, because if you don't add, doesn't change anything. Because if you don't add without a prior examination, it doesn't change anything.
I've been trying to find and look up, and I can't find it, but the verbiage that Anne Marie had with consult with Public Health Department was pretty broad in saying that the veterinarian whose signature is on that rabies certificate has the responsibility, no matter who gives the vaccine. So maybe in our passing this by public health before we vote on it would be a good idea. Yeah, but it's not in writing. Okay, so I think if we, I think maybe Dave mentioned that earlier, if we can get something in writing that, yes, this is the correct interpretation, then I think I would feel comfortable with the broad stroke.
When you say broad stroke, you mean not specifying that there needs to be an examination?
Well, I think, correct,
Okay.
yes.
Where are we getting the needs to have a examination? What section are you looking at for that?
If you go to the RVT, duties of the supervising veterinarian for RVTs, it says no task shall be performed without prior authorization and examination or something to that effect.
Yeah, C, the paragraph right above, the supervising veterinarian shall have examined the animal patient prior to the delegation of any animal health care task. So this would be, an exemption, obviously, to the examination piece. Erica?
I just wanted to say that if without prior examination is added to that section, it should also be added to 4840B to be consistent. 4840B does not talk about the examination requirement either. And so I think it's been assumed, but hasn't been stated explicitly.
And 4840B you'll find at the bottom of page 4 and the top of page 5 in this section here.
I'd say that it's not necessary to change that statute because it's 4836 that requires the board to establish the healthcare tasks that may be performed anyway. So I don't think we need to change 4840. But I would recommend that 2035D, going back to grant with CVMA. At our last meeting, you were concerned that we were adding duties of a supervising veterinarian. That wasn't a proactive thing the veterinarian had to do. Here, we're creating a new authority for RVTs that is not specifically aimed at what the supervising veterinarian has to do. So if we're going to exclude rabies vaccines here, then they should probably just be added to subdivision C that says the supervising veterinarian shall have examined the animal patient. We could just insert, except for rabies vaccines, the supervising veterinarian shall have examined the animal patient. Because if part of us we're concerned about the examination itself prior to administering I'm just saying D is going to have to change to either make it a proactive duty of the supervising veterinarian, or it needs to move to the animal health care tasks that can be performed by an RVT, VA, or permit holder.
I don't know that we want to say except for rabies vaccines, because we don't want it to say that you never have to do an exam on for a rabies vaccine. I don't know that we want to say except for, because I think that says, oh, you never have to do one. If that would be my understanding.
Okay, so 2035D, we've got some language here again. We're gonna keep pushing forward a little bit here, and then we're gonna just tie it up in a nice little package after lunch. It's gonna be awesome. So let's talk about 2035-5, and also let us refer to one of the handouts that you have that says memorandum at the top, Shelter Medicine Working Group. And it has print on both sides, and on the back of that is proposed language for a 20 2036.6, duties of a supervising veterinarian and animal health care tasks for veterinary assistants in the shelter setting, which is not in this packet. 2035.5 then is some existing language, and it has added veterinary assistant. You see the underlying there at the bottom of page 3 in your packet. Why this is relevant and why we're simultaneously discussing this in 2036.6 is because 2035.5 would, the way that it is proposed in this packet, allow an RVT or a veterinary assistant to do vaccine and prophylactic control of internal parasites and external parasites, treat medical conditions based on animal symptoms, and then certain emergency care. If we keep 2035.5 as it is currently and not include veterinary assistant, and then add 2036.6, then it gives an RVT the opportunity to perform more services than the veterinary assistant. And that is the veterinary assistant is then limited to vaccine and control of endo and ectoparasites. So they are related, but one is broader and grants more authority to veterinary assistants than the other. And as we try and create a set of minimum standards for shelters, and we have certainly spent a lot of time talking about veterinary care on intake, the question is, how do we want that to look and how does that need to look? Your thoughts? Yes, Jennifer.
I'm a little divided on this one because as much as I want the RVT to have more authority, the hat I'm wearing today is consumer protection and the animal care and access. So pain control on intake might be something that a veterinary assistant would need to provide because they don't have an RVT and there is no DVM on the property. So again, as much as I would want the RVT to have more authority, I'm leaning toward leaving it the way we have it in our packet, where the veterinary assistant can provide only in the shelter setting, as it says, the same tasks that an RVT would.
Other thoughts?
I would recommend adding permit holder, specifically because of the controlling acute pain problem. I mean, they are VAs, but they have a registration to handle controlled substances. And we keep using permit holder everywhere else. I would think that would be appropriate here because of the acute pain, but also for consistency.
Permit holder, you're referring to the VA CSP?
Yes.
Okay, not the premises permit holder. Okay. So we have language 2035.5 in the packet where the word or phrase "or veterinary assistant" was added. There's also a recommendation to add permit holder, VACSP permit holder. Yes, Jennifer.
Would we not also need to change the title because it specifies registered veterinary technicians, but if we're adding permit holders and assistants?
Yes, we would need to change I don't know that we have control over the titles. I think that.
We do.
Do we? Okay.
Yeah, we could just strike for registered veterinary technicians.
Okay. So we could say duties of supervising veterinarians and animal health care tasks in the shelter setting.
Right.
Christy?
I have a question on E. It says except as necessary in 2035.5A. So they're adopted and returned to the shelter by the owner for treatment of a medical condition. And it says must be examined by the veterinarian prior to treatment or dispensing medication, except as necessary. So if they're owned and they're returning for treatment, why do they not need to be examined now? Why can somebody treat them if they don't need an exam? What's the situation? Why would they not need an exam? They're now with their owner. right?
Well, there are, do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, please.
I'm
need
just, I have no idea on this one. I'm asking, I'm sorry,
Well, I look at it two different ways. If an animal's adopted out of a shelter and it develops a medical problem that it did not have in the shelter, and the people call and say, hey, I adopted this dog, I'm upset with you, the greater good is usually to treat that animal, but that animal should be re-examined by a veterinarian because it is a new problem.
Right.
That's one scenario. Now, the other scenario is, hi, I just adopted this dog for you that's under treatment for parvo. This is the treatment the doctor has outlined for this animal. I'm adopting it out. We need to have you bring it back each day for sub-Q fluids. Our staff will give that even though you've adopted it. The animal's already been examined by a veterinarian. The treatment protocol is in the record. That would be a scenario where it wouldn't need to be examined. Now, that's a little gray area, but that is something that occurs.
but it has been examined then by a
But
veterinarian.
it had been examined by a
So I
veterinarian
don't-
and the diagnosis was made.
Right.
But if a new problem pops up, shelters do bring the animals back for treatment, but the veterinarian better be in the loop and re-examine that
Right,
animal.
so I don't know that I agree with the except as necessary in 2035.5A, because that means then they don't need an examination by the veterinarian. That's implying that they do not, that they can start treatment, and they do not need an examination by a veterinarian.
Dick and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I was on the subcommittee that discussed this back at CVMA, or the committee, and we did discuss this at length and felt that if it is now an owned animal and it comes back to the shelter, it needs to be examined by a veterinarian, like your first scenario. I think your second example is ongoing treatment and wouldn't fall
Right.
into that category. So I agree with Christie. I don't like that verbiage in there. I think if they're coming back and they're owned, then they have to be treated as an owned animal, whether it's a private clinic or whether it's a shelter or veterinarian.
Jeff.
Question, when Tara, you mentioned, and/or Jennifer, there was mention of changing the title and then adding a permit holder. Isn't it the case that all permit holders are veterinary assistants? So,
Yeah, you're correct. They're VAs, they're not RVTs, but part of my suggestion was to maintain consistency because the VA CSP holders are being added slowly but surely across all of the regs.
Jennifer.
To answer Christie and Dr. Sullivan, the way I read this, the except as necessary in 2035.5A was that they would need an examination by a veterinarian unless it's to control an infectious or zoonotic disease or acute pain. We see a lot of also people take their newly adopted dog out to the parking lot, walk right back in and say this dog is coughing. And it could be from extubation, it could be from kennel cough, but if they walk in and say it's foaming at the mouth and twitching, or, it has Giardia, in that case, it would be control of a zoonotic disease, and we would need to possibly treat that without a prior examination because it is a public health concern.
So we can, if there's trouble with that language, I mean, we can certainly have a discussion about striking that language.
Well, I don't like the way it's written. I
Do
don't
you
think-
have yes, Grant, come on down. Do you have an alternative to offer?
Well, I needed clarification,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
now I have it, I need
Okay.
to
Okay.
rethink it.
So in response, Jennifer, to your comment there, 2035.5A does not just stop, from the way I'm reading it, it doesn't just stop with controlling acute pain and zoonotic disease. Turn the page, and it has 1, 2, A, B, 3. That's all part of 2035.5A, as we're reading it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's written poorly.
Okay, so we've got 2035.5 here that we've been discussing. We've discussed adding the VACSP permit holder to Section A in 2035.5. There was also a very brief discussion on whether or not we wanted to narrow 2035.5 and keep it RVT only and change language in a new section 2036.6 that you have as a handout that would allow a supervising veterinarian to establish written orders for veterinary assistants to perform animal control services for vaccination and prophylactic control of endo and ectoparasites on intake. So far, what I've heard is that the 2035.5 language is more liked than the 2036.6 language.
Yeah, I still feel that 2036.6, as much as I like it, I think in a shelter setting, it would limit access.
Any discussion from the audience on this section?
Our committee that met talked about this a lot, and we had a shelter veterinarians there as well, and just felt very strongly that just because of what Jennifer's saying, that limited access should not just be the only reason, and the care of the animal and who's treating the animal is important, and didn't feel that a veterinary assistant without a veterinarian around should be, even under written protocols, providing treatment of medical conditions based on an animal's symptoms. So that's why they rewrote it to just specify the veterinary assistant component that you see in the proposed 2036.6. So that was why we brought that forward, and they did have a very long discussion about the care of the animal under written protocols, which is a big deviation from private practice. And that just because they're shelter animals, they still deserve that same care.
I would like to add that by the definition in the Practice Act, a veterinary assistant is anybody who walks in off the street. And the qualifications of these people, particularly in an animal shelter setting where the veterinarian may be coming in once a week, how much do they really know about the skills of the particular veterinary assistants that work in the shelters? And if any veterinary assistant in the shelter is allowed to do anything that the veterinarian prescribes, I think you're going to find a very low standard for veterinary care in animal shelters.
Yes, Jennifer.
I don't disagree with either Nancy or Val. Believe me, I'm a snob when it comes to RVTs, but it has been pointed out that not every shelter does have RVTs, and ultimately the supervising veterinarian is responsible, so we would have to hold that person accountable to judge the skills of the veterinary assistant that they are hiring and entrusting. Because I really think it should be licensed individuals providing care. It's definitely not the highest standard of care, but it's an access issue, and some of these animals in these remote areas don't have any other options, and they shouldn't be left in pain or ill when there is a protocol in place to take care of them.
Okay. Any other comments on 2035.5 or 2036.6 at this stage? We've got, again, just in the packet as we move forward, some of this was for your information, but 4840 authorized services by technicians and assistants. And here is language where I think that this comes from our last meeting and where we're talking about the difference between animal health care services and necessary and prompt veterinary care. And it seems to me that at the last meeting, the language got changed to necessary and prompt veterinary care. Why don't we, let's see, you've got the latest language, right, Ethan, in front of us over here? Yeah. Yeah, so we do have that as a 3-page handout here, and now it still says animal health care services at this point. Okay, that's current language. Okay. Okay, yes. So the addition here is veterinary assistants. I do think that there's a proposed change. I seem to recall that we had this discussion in a vote, and I think it may be in front of the board on 4840, and the phrase necessary and prompt veterinary care. We'll move on from there. Medical records, I just grabbed the Food and Ag Code on medical records. Obviously, there needs to be records in a shelter setting, and that's already set forth there. And then we have the language that already exists on controlled substances. We've got the VACSP, the euthanasia training, and then we have the minimum standards language, which we're not going to go through and pare down today to make shelter specific, but just again a recognition that the minimum standards are going to look similar, and I think we're in consensus on that. So that is what's in front of us. What is, my question at this stage is, what is missing? Is there a piece that's missing from this that we need to try and find a way to capture and somehow incorporate into a future set of minimum standards for a shelter premises?
Can I just clarify something real quick? 4840, page 5, subdivision B. I'm confused as to what's happening with animal health care services. That's already in statute. What's stricken here is necessary and prompt veterinary care. That was proposed to be added at the last meeting. That was just part of the proposal, to strike animal health care services and add necessary and prompt veterinary care. I'm just confused as to how this is being presented. Right. So what is the ask here?
So we have, we voted at the last meeting or the meeting before to change the language to necessary and prompt veterinary care. And the question is, in the shelter, and that's a blanket, that's a 4840 is a blanket statute. In the shelter setting, because the language that we have here, we think would be existing in its own little shelter section.
She just thought the same thing you did. Necessary and prompt should not be stricken, and it should be opposite of what is in our packet.
And that's not what I think. I think that animal health care services is a better term than necessary and prompt.
Right, but you thought that it was.
So at our last meeting, did we not vote to strike animal health care services and put in necessary and prompt care?
Yes.
We did.
It was issue 3.
Right.
In the minutes.
Yes.
Which I happen to disagree with.
Right, I'm not saying your
Yeah.
personal opinion.
Yeah.
But that's what she had too, and so
Yeah.
that's what she was confused.
Yeah. So the question here for us is whether or not we prefer with 4840 in the shelter setting, the language is proposed here in B, or to be consistent with the language that we voted on at the last meeting, which had necessary and prompt veterinary care.
I get it. It's the same.
Yes, Dick?
I may have missed this whole context, but I thought that it was brought up somewhere we did have necessary and prompt veterinary care, and I thought that Bonnie Lutz said that was undefinable, and what is defined is animal health care services. So I thought that was the context of where things were at. But I might have dreamt that one.
Yeah.
No, I'm thinking you're right, because I listened to it, so. Or I was here, because I remember it.
I do recall correctly that this committee did vote for necessary and
That is
prompt
correct.
veterinary
We did.
care.
It's
Yes,
in the minutes.
yeah.
I wasn't here, so.
Yeah,
I don't think it was the last meeting.
It may have been the
I think
meeting
It
before.
was the meeting before,
But I
we
could-
were here.
yeah,
Because
The
I
meeting
remember it.
before?
yeah.
It's item 3 in our last meeting.
Page 4. So will you read that, please?
Dr. Klingborg addressed, this is issue 3 on page 4 of present agenda. Issue 3, Authority of RVTs and Staff in Shelters. Dr. Klingborg addressed the MDC and stated that the recommendation before them is to amend Business and Professions Code Section 4840B to include veterinary assistance and replace animal health care with necessary and prompt veterinary care.
Okay, so it was the meeting before. Yeah.
Was there a vote somewhere here?
Okay, so we're not clear on that. The bottom line is, right now, we have the opportunity with the language that's in front of us to decide, do we prefer animal health care or necessary and prompt veterinary services? Okay. So that is the discussion in front of us right now.
Question, wasn't as I recall, there was, and it might have been from Bonnie Lutz, as Dick remembered, but I thought there was a precedence for the term animal health care services in previous language and legislation, so it just made it more consistent to stick with that.
And it's never been defined.
And I remember the discussion, and there was also elsewhere where there was necessary and prompt veterinary care. So there were certain codes that had this language and certain codes that had that language. And so it was a matter of just cherry picking which one you wanted to grab. The feeling was that in this committee was that animal health care tasks or services was too broad, and necessary and prompt narrowed it and didn't give quite as much of a blank check. I mean, that was the discussion that we had a couple meetings ago. But in our discussion, again, we thought, well, maybe necessary and prompt seemed more like emergency services or services of some urgency rather than prophylactic services, vaccines and things of this sort, ecto and endoparasites, et cetera. So that, again, this was where we went. So for our purposes in the shelter setting, do we prefer the terminology animal health care tasks or necessary and prompt care? What is offered in front of you is animal health care tasks.
Yes, that's what they just read.
Sounds like a great lunch topic.
Perfect.
I like this.
So we're almost to lunch. We've just got just a couple more little things. Are there any things that you feel as you look at what was at page 1 of the packet, the items that have been identified by various stakeholders and subcommittees, are there any things that you feel that we have omitted in this language?
You even moved.
The one thing that did come up at the last meeting that we have not specifically discussed was sanitation and housing, and that I've identified. And there were discussions about the fact that the inspectors can only go into the area where the veterinary care is occurring, and yet perhaps there needs to be some language that if that animal goes into a general population that did receive veterinary care, perhaps there needs to be an extension, and wherever that animal is housed after that veterinary care, inspection authority should extend to that.
Yeah,
So we did have a very
October
brief
we
discussion on that last time.
That's a long time ago.
But it's not in here. That's a hole. That's something we're missing. This is, what you have in front of you is Swiss cheese, and you get to fill in the holes. Yeah,
Dr. Klingberg?
yes.
We have a solution.
We have a
She
solution.
actually found the vote from the October meeting.
Yay.
Here.
Will you read it, please?
This is from the minutes from October 17, 2017. Dr. Grant moved and Dr. Sullivan seconded the motion to amend CCR Section 4840B and add VAs to the provision, and also to strike the term animal health care services and replace it with necessary and prompt veterinary care. So the language reads, may perform necessary and prompt veterinary care on those animals impounded. The motion carried 6 to 2 to 1. Dr. Klingborn and Mr. Johnson voted no. Ms. Laredo abstained.
There you go.
So we're just as confused today as we were in
I think
October.
there was further discussion when Bonnie was here, and well, anyways. Maybe I
So
did.
thank you for finding that, and I have no
all right.
idea why I didn't
I just
know.
wanted to say that the requirement that shelters provide necessary and prompt veterinary care is meant as as the minimum that they're allowed,
Right.
that they're required to provide,
As a
not
minimum.
a ceiling on what they can provide. And so to limit what VAs and RVTs can do on shelter animals, to me, it doesn't make sense. They should be allowed to do what they need to do in order to care for the animals. Again, necessary and prompt is the minimum, it's not the maximum.
So would you favor the animal health care tasks or the necessary and prompt language,
I would very much favor your
animal health care tasks?
animal health
Thank
care
you.
tasks.
Yes, that was the correct answer. Good job. So on the discussion of sanitation and housing, again, there is a part there where inspection authority is limited. And do we feel that in creating a minimum standard for the facility, have we gone far enough? That's my question. Okay?
Minimum standard for that part of the hospital.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Good.
Any other omissions, Dr. Grant?
Fairly small. Under 2035, we didn't really talk about one, under A. It says supervising veterinarian may not delegate a function or allowable animal health care task, and RVTVA requires extensive clinical skills. I'm not sure we need the term extensive.
So this language doesn't actually exist right now. 2035 is going to be discussed by the board tomorrow, possibly, or by the MDC. So we did have language that was voted down at the last meeting, and I simply put this in as a placeholder.
Okay.
And so the language is very informal. It should just be kind of a grayed out. We know we want to do something here, but we don't know what it is yet.
So we're not dealing with this.
Yeah, whatever we do with this information after lunch, we're going to strike one at this point. And then when 2035, I think what we want to know is, do we want something that looks like 2035 in the shelter minimum standards? And then when 2035 is finalized here, either this meeting or the next couple, then we'll know that will need to be inserted in that area.
Deal with. All right.
Yeah, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Okay. All right, any other questions or comments from the committee or the public? Then let us take a 1-hour lunch. All right, I'd like to call the meeting back to order. We left off on agenda item 5, but we're going to take a brief sidetrack and turn the microphone over to Ethan.
Before we continue on with our discussion, I'd like to bring Dr. Waterhouse up here, our board president, and express some appreciation to our dearly departing committee members.
The 4 people who are sadly leaving the MDC, we have you stand and we have a present for each of you. So Dr. Klingler, Dr. Grant, Dave Johnson, and Diana Hagel. We have a small token of our appreciation. We know how much work this is. We sit here and watch this. And we know how long you've been doing it. And we really want to thank you. You have big shoes to fill. This is hard with half the board leaving. This is a very small token of our appreciation for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So of course I take the opportunity to take up time and say something on the mic. I won't take up.
Please
too much
identify
time.
yourself.
See, you got the hang of it. You better pass that gavel. Anne Marie Delmanio, public. I had the opportunity to work with these gentlemen and Diane for the 5 years that I was at the Veterinary Medical Board, and I can tell you they taught me so much about this profession that is very important, but also they taught me so much about leadership and moving things forward and taking personal responsibility for serving the public the way you do. I truly admire you all. I thank you for your talents, your time, your leadership, your friendship, and for leaving the MDC better than you found it. And I hope that when you pass this baton, you will serve as colleagues and mentors to the people that take the place behind you, because you've got a good thing going here. And I just hope that it continues, and I'm sure Jeff will do his part to, Dr. Pollard will do his part to make sure that happens, and the rest of the MDC will support you in that. But you will truly be missed. You are already missed in my heart, so.
Thank you. Would the departing members like to give your farewell tour right now instead of later on in the agenda? Would you like to share your wisdom?
Goodness.
Yeah.
Well, thank you ever so much. I mean, it really is moving to have the honor to serve on this committee and to represent the board over the years. I was talking with Dr. Grant over the break, and we were talking about K-State, where he graduated from, and I told him a story, and I'll tell it to you, just to show how much the veterinary profession has changed over the years, not just in my time. But my uncle graduated from K-State Veterinary School in 1922, and his first job out of vet school was as a traveling salesman for Ralston Purina, traveling in Oklahoma and southern Kansas. And the story, I wish I'd talked to him more, but one of the stories I recall is that traveling salesmen had to stay on the main roads because Pretty Boy Floyd and Bonnie and Clyde would accost traveling salesmen as they got off the main roads. So you've come a long way, baby. And I've seen part of it, and it's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It has most certainly been a very interesting journey with all of you folks. I started working in front of the board on that side of the table back with several of you in the late 70s. So it has been a long journey. This year marks 52 years for me in veterinary medicine. So it has been a very long journey. I have seen many changes. They're all for the better. I think the thing that I like the most is the professional relationships. And even though we have differences of opinion, all of us are dedicated to the welfare of the animals and the good of the consumer. And so that's probably the best take-home message, is we all need to continue that work. So thank you very much.
2 minutes, Bill.
I don't even know where to begin. First of all, to leave this committee better than when we found it, seeing as it didn't exist when we found it, wasn't much of a step. But thank you anyway. Yeah. 9 years. I don't know where 9 years went. It was, I think, supposed to be 6.
Supposed to be a year and a half.
Or a year and a half,
Yeah, it was a year and a half task force.
Right,
Yeah,
task force. So, you know, I've loved it. It's one of the best things that I think I've ever done in veterinary medicine. Met people that I would not have otherwise met, enjoyed the heck out of it. The things that this committee does, I know Jeff will find his way, and the committee will find their way to keep this going. But there's so much that happens, you never know. When I was chair and we would report to VMB, you would show up with 3 things on your list and talk to the committee or to the board, and you would leave with 8 or 9 things on your list. And this group works through it, and I think there's no other group that takes the time and the effort to do what they've done. And the best thing for me, though, out of this are the people that I met here. And that's what I'm going to take home with me. The only other thing I'll say is my first plaque I had, and she still wants it back, but it's not going to happen. It had the Department of Motor Vehicles. First thing I looked at here is the Veterinary Medical Board. So you got it right this time. You should have been consistent, the Department of Motor Vehicles, so.
He's all about accuracy.
Yeah, I know. Don't you hate that when that happens?
So I too want to thank everyone. Been great relationships here. We've had rigorous discussion and some really, really difficult issues that we've tackled on behalf of the consumer and animals. I don't think any of us are burnt out, but we could, because it's been a labor of love. By the same token, term limits are a good thing. It's good to stir the pot every now and then and get new folks in. So we'll miss you. We're going to be available as a resource should anybody want to talk to us at any point. Happy to help. I do think that my advice for incoming members would be put the work in. You know, this is something you're only going to get out of it, and the consumer is only going to get out of it what you put into it. Do the homework, put the work in, because it's important. What we do here matters. And that's why we kept re-upping, is because we could see the value in what was happening. So again, thanks for the opportunity. And thank you for leading us for all those years. Yep.
So again, thank you. You guys have done an incredible job, and it's going to be very hard to fill these shoes again. But I really do want to thank you for your hard work for the people of California, the animals that we all love, and to give back to our profession. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And the show must go on, so we're going to move forward with where we were with the shelter premises permit registration. We had some, Dick, did you want to start the discussion here at this point?
Well, I had another conversation with Tara, and so I think we may need to approach this on two fronts. What I think I would like to do is at least try it through the regulatory process first. I think our statutory reference, our statutory permission to do this is under the premises requirements. That gives us the authority to write minimum standards for whatever type of practice, including shelter medicine. So I would like to pursue that. And then if we run into problems through the regulatory process, we can have language to do a statutory change if that is required, or if that needs to be done. And I think we've got a good start on that end. So I would turn that over to Tara as far as commenting on what she would like to discuss.
Okay, so I've got another version of a revised statute on the premises permit registration, Business and Professions Code, Section 4853. So in this version, under subdivision B, I've moved animal shelter to be listed third because I don't want this to look like premises really just means animal shelter, animal building, animal kennel. I want to make sure that the emphasis is still on building, kennel, because those are locations that may not be obvious, but as long as those locations are facilities where veterinary medicine is practiced, they would fall under this definition of premises. And then under subdivision C, there's a new definition of animal shelter, which reads, animal shelter for the purpose of this chapter shall mean a publicly or privately owned or operated building where stray, unwanted, or seized animals are deposited or impounded. This change is to recognize public agencies that impound or seize animals if they are contracting or if they themselves take the animals to a building where the animals are then cared for with veterinary medicine. They would need the premises permit, but also any private organization, which arguably includes humane societies and any other shelter that takes in animals and then provides veterinary medicine, they would fall under this definition. So it would be all-inclusive. I'm providing this to you for your review, potential deliberation, but not necessarily any motion to move this onto the board, because I would agree with Dr. Sullivan that as long as the underlined text on page 2 of 13 of item 5, as long as that definition of animal shelter, that proposal is not included and moved on to the board, I don't believe you would need this statutory revision. That's, for me, what created the problem, in that it appears that the board, by regulation, is creating a new requirement for animal shelters to obtain a premises permit, but under BPC 4853, if they already meet this definition, they're required to be permitted, or registered. This is solely for the event that OAL, if there is a proposed regulation package moving forward on these issues, if there's a hiccup at OAL, we could bring this statutory change to the board quickly so that they could submit it for submission to the legislature to clarify the animal shelter problem insofar as it relates to the premises permit. Just to move things along, I appreciate that this issue has been deliberated on for quite some time, so I wouldn't want to necessarily hold it up at this point to make a statutory revision that is largely unnecessary at this point.
Dick?
With that said, and that approach, do we need any of this? Do we need any of these 3 paragraphs? Can we just say that, or I guess the 3rd paragraph actually would then be a delineation of the minimum standards for shelter medicine?
Right.
Okay.
So do we, I'm a little confused by the conversation. I understand that we've got this 4853 language that's a proxy that we may put into play, but what specific language are we discussing here right now? Do we have a definition of an animal shelter? Is it the language that we see in C of 4853? And do we need that as we try and develop these minimum standards, or are we just saying we don't need to do any of that? I'm confused about where we are at this point.
I would say that we do not, at this point, we are not moving forward item C.
Right.
Whether we need it even stated in B, I think that's fine. I'm not even sure we need it there. I think as we have done with the proposed minimum standards for the premise permit, premise registration, that we just add animal shelter as one of those that we're developing minimum standards for. So, and I kind of went back here. I don't know the exact number, but it would be something 2030.18 or something like that would be a minimum standards shelter medicine. And then we do like we did with the other minimum standards. We go through each item that we have in small the fixed premises, small animal fixed premise, see what applies to shelter medicine and what doesn't, and just go through that list and voila.
So we're taking a little bit of a different approach. We're talking about taking a different approach where we're going to develop minimum standards for shelter, animal
That's
shelter.
what I thought we were doing from the beginning.
Right. And I would agree. I guess, but now we're being a little bit more specific, and that's great, because we had many tasks, and one of them was to define what an animal shelter was. And so do we have a definition for what an animal shelter is as we create these minimum standards?
I don't think we do.
Okay.
Other than what is already referred to as to what, I guess in regs, there is a definition of county and city agencies that impound animals.
Okay. the goal of the language that's in front of you was really to try and make sure that we had at least all of the background materials that would be needed to create the minimum standards, and that we had not omitted any areas, so that from here, it's all in one succinct place, and then the beginning of crafting them can occur. This certainly is not a completed document. This is not a set of minimum standards. It's grabbing and going from different parts of the Practice Act, and that's a recognition that the shelters provide a different kind of services. So do we feel as a committee that we have captured all of the elements that we need to satisfy the various stakeholders that we've heard over the last couple of years in the packet item, agenda item 5, within those pages? And so at this stage of the game, because this is still an agendized item, we don't actually have to take a vote right now. We just have to have an understanding about what our direction is. And the direction moving forward would be then to use all of these materials and to craft a set of minimum standards. Using these materials, right?
Agreed.
Okay.
I would assume that we would still need 2035.5 or 2035 point, what was the new section that was discussed? We
So
still
we had-
need that section.
Right, 2035.5, where we discussed adding the VACSP permit holder
Well, and yes, and veterinary assistant.
and veterinary assistant as well was added in 2035.5, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Discussion.
Since I was the one who raised the definitional issue of animal shelter in the first place, I think this proposal is an appropriate fix. Putting the definition of animal shelter in a regulation is kind of like the tail wagging the dog. I mean, regulations have to key off statutes, and this is an appropriate place to put it. And without going into the specific verbiage, I noticed that building was substituted for facility in your earlier draft. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, the reason is to maintain the building verbiage in 4853 subdivision B. There was concern raised that the use of the term facility might be confusing when applied to the regulations and the minimum standards for all of the various facilities there. So I just changed facility to building, which is in keeping with building under subdivision B.
It's more limiting.
I guess if we look at the work that was just accepted, we have large animal fixed facility and small animal fixed facility. So we actually, if we're going to maintain some consistency with our 2030 language in other areas, facility is the word that's used. Anyway, I don't know that we need to argue that today.
No.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that we're going to simply continue this agenda item and move forward. We've discussed it. We've tried to capture all of the elements. We have an agreement about what the language needs to look like, what needs to be included in it. It's a matter of drafting minimum standards from that. This is Christie.
Okay, as far as the definition, though, we're not including that definition in that.
I feel like if we look at, again, if we go with like small animal fixed facility, we have a model for our language here for.
No, as far as animal shelter, the definition.
Yes, I'm answering your question, but
Okay.
I'm getting there.
Okay, that's fine.
So for purposes of these regulations, a small animal fixed facility shall mean a building where veterinary medicine as various branches are being practiced. So I feel like whatever we do for animal shelter needs to have a similar flavor.
I guess I'm more concerned about this definition that was just handed
Okay.
to us, so.
So let us try and just make sure we have consensus that we are now not voting on
Right.
this, but continuing this agenda item. And if we do, then I certainly am happy to have a discussion about definitions. Okay. There was definitely discussion earlier today about SPCA and humane societies, and this new language does incorporate that. So I do think that that deserves to be on the table. Do we want to have that discussion right now? Or do we want to move forward onto the next agenda item and realize that that's going to be part of a bigger packet that's put together with language of minimum standards? I'm comfortable having that discussion either way. Dick?
I guess I don't understand exactly why we couldn't define shelters under the minimum standards, describing it as we have in small animal fix for these purposes. This is what we're defining.
That's what I'm
shelter
asking.
medicine.
Is it this definition that we're moving forward, or are we going to clarify this definition? That's what I'm asking.
We don't have that language. That's gonna be developed by another subcommittee. But I don't know why that needs to be in statute, I guess, as long as we're running off of the premises permit statute.
Dave?
And Dr. Sullivan, you've got a good point, because in 2030.3 small animal vaccination clinic, they specifically define what a small animal vaccination clinic is. That's the very first phrase. So there'd be no reason if we had 2030 point whatever for minimum standards of shelters, your first statement would be define what the animal shelter is. That's
And we may get pushback from OAL, and if we do, then
Right.
we're
But you can also
already a
say, hey,
step
it's
forward
already
on
done
that.
in 3 other sections. So that would seem the logical way to go.
What you could do is use the definition of C that I've proposed to incorporate that in your regulation so that it's just for purposes of this
just this.
minimum standards regulation. I think I tried to make it succinct enough to model after the premises requirement, so then when you're doing the regulation aimed at the shelter, you would then reference section 4853, and hopefully that might link it up appropriately.
Again, the language in C has privately owned. Our original language seemed to be focused on public animals. We talked about public animals, and where are we with privately owned?
Well, that had to do with the seized animals, to cover your seized animals.
No, this says publicly owned building and operated buildings. This is publicly owned or privately owned buildings.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
So from the discussion that occurred before lunch, there was concern about leaving privately operated shelters out of this regulation package, because if they're not included, they don't get to qualify for this limited circumstance where RVTs and VAs can provide specific animal health care tasks. So in order to provide for those private organizations who have a facility or building where they're in-housing animals and providing on-site veterinary care, they would be allowed to use the RVT VA permit holder authority under this rulemaking package. So that's why private ownership and private operation is included.
so, but when does that authority stop? So when do they not have to have a veterinarian on this premises? Because they are a privately owned organization. Therefore, when they are not examining impounded animals for this purpose, they can utilize, because they're covered under this, they can utilize this definition and have their VAs and RVTs examine and perform procedures that are defined under this section without an examination, and a veterinarian does not have to have an exam or anything, and because they are privately owned, we're exempting them.
So for those tasks that you're authorizing to be performed by RVTs and VAs in the shelter setting, you're going to need to be specific that the animal shelter we're talking about for purposes of this limited exemption means providing these healthcare services to stray, unwanted, or seized animals that are deposited or impounded with the premises or the organization.
Is that clear under that definition?
It's not. I'm saying what you could do is use a version of this with your minimum standards regulation to really cinch it up. But I think that's an excellent point because, yeah.
That's the only thing I'm concerned about.
I think there's a way to craft that where it's that provision of healthcare services outside of the veterinary examination is only for those animals who don't have a known owner.
That's my only concern with this.
Okay. Any other questions, comments on this agenda item?
Just one. I'm back to building. The building needs to be changed in this context because it's the enterprise, it's the operation, not the ownership of the building, you see. So the way it's written, if the enterprise is a tenant, it's talking about private ownership of the building. And that's irrelevant to this discussion.
Right,
Yeah.
because the building
Could be owned by anybody.
included under this definition right now is for the sole purpose of premises permit registration, focusing on the premises, not the practice. So if we clarify that the practice is only on unowned animals, such as they are stray, unwanted, or seized,
Okay.
and deposited or impounded, I think the building piece comes out.
Okay.
We can
Okay.
get where we need to go.
All right. Great.
Any other questions, committee? Comments, public? All right, the work on agenda item number 5 continues. Agenda item number 6. Discussion and consideration of amendments to RVT animal healthcare tasks regarding dental extractions. Dr. Pollard is the task force for this.
So, this was an education, for me anyway, and I don't think it'll end or be settled at today's meeting. But what I'd like to do is, I'd like to just touch on what's in the included packet, explain why I put it there, and then use that as kind of a springboard to cover the, at least start to cover the seminal items, and then discuss. So the subcommittee was generated by a letter by a public member who happens to be a veterinarian, written to the VMB in January. The letter's included in the packet. I have been in contact with this individual, specifically asked if it was okay that her name not be redacted, and she said that was fine. She writes a very cogent letter of concern stating that she's seen what she interprets to be illegal, unlicensed practice. And the best synthesis that I came to, both after the initial letter and then subsequent follow-ups, are that she is an experienced veterinarian, has many years of practice ownership, And like all of us, if we're doing our own thing in our own little world, we see it from our point of view. And she did things the way that she wanted them done, and she sold her practice, subsequently went out to do, I presume, relief work, or at least work in different practices where it obviously happens differently. And some of the things she saw were disturbing, and in the letter, the last paragraph is a suggestion for a modification to our California VPA regarding dental extractions. And subsequently, she indicated she found this language in another state's VPA. So page 2 of the packet is just a copy of 2036, our Animal Healthcare Task for RVTs in California, which, as we all know, includes anesthesia, apply cast and splints, and perform dental extractions. It does say before those 3 items, these 3 items are done only under direct supervision. The third page is my synthesis of a very long 61-page document that I copied off the AVMA site, and it is a more inclusive list of specified duties for veterinary technicians and assistants, state by state. And I'll come back to that because I think that's where I want to launch off the discussion. Fourth page is just a website. And this website, I couldn't attach it to the following 8-page document, also from the AVMA, but is a truncated version of that 61-page collection as it regards specifically to dentistry. So this 8 pages in this AVMA document is a state-by-state listing of duties for RVTs or CVTs, LVTs, and then veterinary assistants. Following that is the statement from the dental college. So this is what, in our profession, the experts feel should be standard of care in the practice of dentistry. And I highlighted that the bottom line is extraction of teeth should be in the purview of veterinarians per their mind, and I'll leave it at that. The last couple of pages, as most of us probably know here, most specialties now have the ability, they aren't all fully developed yet, but the ability to obtain specialization, abbreviated VTS. If you go to the website for the VTS specialty in veterinary dentistry, you'll see this page, it's numbered 1 in the packet. And at the bottom, it lists AVDT members. These are the people in California as current as the date that I looked this up a few weeks ago. And they number 7. And I interpret that to mean there are 7 individuals in the state of California who are VTS in dentistry. And the next page then tells you how you become a VTS specialized person. And in a word, 2 words, it is long and complicated. And it includes things like 3 years of work experience with a minimum of 6,000 hours. It includes the requirement that all applicants must have a mentor who must be one of these 7 people. And a veterinarian is not good enough, an RVT is not good enough, another dentist is not good enough. They have to be one of these 7 people. And then they are wonderful to list bounds of resources and websites and things that you can resource to train you to do this if you find that one of those 7 people. But it just struck me as a large dichotomy between one, let me rephrase. There's 2 issues that Dr. Clemens in her initial letter wrote with concern about. In a nutshell, they are the definition of extraction and the issue of direct supervision that she views as not happening. And I foresee at the end of today, next meeting, however many meetings it takes, I foresee a point at which we come to a consensus on certainly the definition of an extraction. The reference to the other states' laws I found very interesting because I went through tasks other than dentistry. The language that she found, she mentioned in an email she thought was from Georgia, I think it's from Delaware, but a couple of states have very similar language. And then if I could have you reference this, the third page, yeah. So the third page of the packet has a highlighted website at the top, and then I've abbreviated 3 sections, RVT, LVT, CVT duties, and then I broke it down by states. And I just went through the 61-page document, and I collated the states that have language similar to California's, language more restrictive, language that gives the permission to do dental work to other than RVTs, and to what degree. And I don't think it's very telling, honestly, to even, it took a while to go through this, and I thought it was interesting for a while. And then I thought, you know, at the end, who cares what they do in Oklahoma? I think we should do what we feel is the best thing to do, and we're going to do that anyway. Using some other language, if it fits with what we believe is the right thing to do, is a fine starting point. But I don't think just because the last paragraph in Dr. Clemens' letter, however valid and however in agreement you might be with it, that should be the standard that we should necessarily leap for. And however you come down on the divide of the permissibility of non-veterinarians, whoever they may be, because there are some states that give a lot of leeway to veterinary assistants to do things that we don't do in California, for example. Wherever you come down on who can do what, the job is getting done, meaning animals' teeth are being cleaned in some fashion. Some of it is done above board, legally, however you want to phrase it. Some of it is done in better ways than other ways and other places. And some of it is done at just vast differences in cost. And as we all know who've worked on animals and had to recommend and then provide dental work, it depends on who you talk to. One of the dentists in San Diego County spoke at a CE meeting a couple of months ago. His perspective is clearly very different than all of ours. And in his world, dentistry is the only problem that happens in veterinary medicine. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. And I think in his mind, and these are not his words, but clearly in his mind, RVTs should not be doing any extractions. I think if you pressed him, he would say veterinarians shouldn't be doing extractions unless you have superior training like he does. So I would like to point out that in order to get that superior training as a technician, you have to do lots of extra credit. And then the dichotomy of those 7 people, or people who do it at that level, of then should we decide RVTs can't do extractions, however we define it. It seems absurd to me to put in 6,000 hours to learn something that you're not legally permitted to do. So I will stop there and throw it to the wolves.
All right, Christy,
I'm going
and
to
then
point out
Jennifer.
that even after they got their VTS in dentistry, they were not allowed to do extractions. So I'll point that out as well.
Well, they're RVTs, aren't they?
But when they got their VTS in, and I know that this was changing, but when they got their VTS in dentistry, they made an agreement that they would not perform extractions. Doesn't matter what state they were in, they signed an agreement.
And I think that's totally believable and understandable if you recognize that to get to the level of ETS in dentistry, you pretty much have to work for a dentist.
Right.
And so that person, by virtue of the statement of the college, says right out of the gate, you're not going to do extractions. So I see where that's coming from.
And so I will say that I know a lot of people in California that were interested in pursuing the VTS in dentistry until they found that out, because what they loved doing were extractions. They went to a lot of training. They learned how to do it. So they didn't pursue that route. So you might have seen a lot more names on that list.
Okay, Jennifer, and then David.
I'm confused about the whole concept of it. The way I'm seeing this is unlicensed activity, in which case the board should do something about that unlicensed activity. When we were talking about extended duties for RVTs and potential unlicensed activity with specialty medicine, it was decided that we were not going to change an entire regulation because of some unlicensed activity. So it to me looks like this is proposing that we remove, almost suggesting that we remove dental extractions from 2036, which I would definitely not be in favor of. I don't have a problem clarifying it. It's always been obvious to me that if you're drilling, that's performing dental surgery, and RVTs are prohibited from that. So clarifying it, I'm fine with that, but to change an entire regulation or to, her suggestion, I see where she's coming from with that, but that's such a long suggestion for the, 3 words that we have. So I'm confused by the whole concept. To me, it seems like we should be doing something about this unlicensed activity and not so much looking at these regulations.
Could I address that? I think it is not a foregone conclusion that your assumption that drilling in all people's minds is the definition of surgery, so wouldn't be permitted. So I think the definition of extraction varies state to state, and clearly it's my impression she wants our definition to be more specific. And I think I hear you say, and I agree with that, you wouldn't be averse to that. So I'm curious to see what we all think of what an extraction is, much less who should do it.
David.
The regulation authorizing dental extractions was put into place in 1980, and it was specifically put there with no description because veterinary medicine changes. How teeth were extracted in 1980 and how they've evolved to 2018 are 2 completely different worlds. I guess the question I would ask, I can appreciate this veterinarian's concern in what she saw that she thinks is unlicensed activity, but those regulations have been on the books since 1980. They are working. Is the board inundated with complaints about dental extractions and RVTs taking teeth out? And is this something that we need to rush out and protect the consumer? Or with this existing language that has worked since 1980, is it being regulated in the private veterinary hospital under the supervision of the veterinarian that's responsible for that patient? I have my own opinion about how teeth should be extracted and who should do it, but in general, we've just created something that a technician can do. It's been sitting there since 1980. There's plenty of other things in veterinary medicine where there's variations of how how veterinary medicine is practiced. Every day, veterinary hospitals provide veterinary services to animals that don't get an examination by a veterinarian. So there's all kinds of things like that going on. If this veterinarian has this concern, then it should be a complaint of illegal activity. I'm not sure we need to go out and jump on a regulatory change based upon one letter. Now, if Ethan or Dr. Sullivan or Jennifer can tell me that every month you're getting a letter to the board on dentistry procedures, then maybe we should go through the regulatory process. I'm not sure it's needed.
I don't think we are. I don't think that's something that is occurring regularly.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I think it works. I think how it is written has worked. I think it's left up to the individual veterinarian with what they think is in the best interest of their patient, and they've already assessed the skill level of the person that they've allowed to perform that procedure.
Comments from the audience?
I couldn't agree more with what David just said, that when RVTs were given the job task of dental extraction, it became an RVT duty, and dentistry in the small animal practice pretty much evolved in the hands of RVTs, not veterinarians. RVTs actually get more education in dentistry in RVT school than veterinarians get in veterinary school. At UC Davis, RVTs are teaching veterinary students how to extract teeth, including how to section teeth. It is, and as David pointed out, in 40 years, the techniques used for dental extraction have evolved tremendously. Now, I happen to be a person who worked with a veterinary dentist for the last 15 years of my career. I was an assistant to a veterinary dentist. I never extracted one tooth because the veterinary dentist was sitting across the table from me, and he extracted all the teeth. In general private practice, it's the RVTs that do virtually all the extractions. And if we start saying that RVTs can't section teeth, which is the gold standard for extracting a multi-rooted tooth, then either the patient's going to suffer because they're going to start using the old-fashioned, more traumatic techniques, or the veterinarian's going to have to stop what they're doing and come back into the treatment room to extract a tooth. That's going to cause delays. It's going to cost increase in cost, and as we heard earlier, dentistry is already costing too much in veterinary medicine. This will increase the cost, and then we're going to find that more of our patients are not going to get dental procedures done because the clients just can't afford it. With no complaints other than this letter, I don't see why we are even considering a regulatory change. And if you read this letter carefully, she is not describing illegal activity. Perhaps when she talks about drilling bone. But everything else that she's talking about, she doesn't know what that direct supervision means because there must have been a veterinarian in the building who was supervising this person who was extracting the teeth. She clearly was not the supervisor, but there must have been another veterinarian there who was a supervisor. She's thinking that direct supervision means that the supervisor has to be in the same room, and we all know that that's not true. She's talking about the person diagnosing. Well, recognizing pathology is not diagnosing. We require that RVTs can recognize pathology for a number of reasons, and particularly in dentistry, any competent RVT is charting when they are doing an oral examination. Charting requires recognition of pathology, and in order to go to the veterinarian and say, "Doctor, I've found such and such a problem," you need to know what you're looking at. So recognizing pathology is not diagnosing. Diagnosing is the job of the veterinarian, and it should be the job of the veterinarian to determine which teeth need to be extracted. But they don't necessarily know which teeth need to be extracted until the RVT points it out to them after they found something wrong in the oral examination. So I would say that it can be a little confusing. Because it just says dental extraction and people are not quite sure where the line between dentistry and surgery is. But keep in mind, veterinary medicine has been defined as medicine, surgery, and dentistry. Dentistry is distinct from surgery. And using a drill in dentistry is not considered surgery. A drill and a burr in dentistry is just a normal instrument. It's a dental instrument. It's not a surgical instrument. So I would suggest that it might be interesting to talk about, is there a way to make this more clear? But I would certainly say that any outcome where you would start restricting what an RVT can do in an extraction based upon this one letter in the absence of any other complaints about RVTs performing extractions would be a disservice to our patients and a disservice to our clients.
Hi, my name is Cindy Savely. I'm an RVT. When I read this letter, there was a couple things that stood out to me. One is that if technicians are truly diagnosing, that should be stopped, as well as, in my opinion, drilling bone. But with that said, I think this is one complaint. I guess we haven't been informed of any others. And I think this would be an opportunity for the duties of the supervising veterinarian, have that veterinarian be informed of what their duties are in supervising these type of procedures. I did ask a friend of mine who's an RVT who does dentistries, probably 30 a month. And I asked her, do you do a lot of sectioning? And she goes, oh yeah. And she does it almost with every procedure. Once a tooth has been identified that needs to be extracted by the veterinarian, she will then do the extraction, and most times that includes sectioning. So, thank you.
Anybody else in the audience? So I'm going to be the fly in the ointment here for a minute. I don't think that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. So while I would agree with that, anytime we're cutting any tissue, including a tooth, it seems to me that that's some subset of surgery. Now, we have the relief hole provision in the regs. So we do have that, and we also see that RVTs can do suturing. So we do have some little subsets of surgery that we have said it's okay for RVTs to perform. But I'm troubled by us just saying, oh, sectioning a tooth isn't some form of surgery, because it seems to me that it is. Now, I think we can agree that there is sufficient training for RVTs to perform that subset of surgery. I'm not opposed to that. But the elephant in the room is cutting a tooth surgery or not? It seems to me like it is. Yes, Bill.
I think we're getting into an area now that you are talking about being prescriptive within the Practice Act, which was something that we've never have gone to. And if we're now talking about a certain way to do an extraction, then maybe we should talk about a certain way to do a spay. And maybe we should do these with, endoscopes and things like that. I totally agree that we are way off the base in trying to fix a problem that doesn't need to be fixed. And prescribing a certain way to do something, I think it is a philosophical discussion. Is it surgery or is it not? But the point of it's the intent. That was the whole discussion we had with the relief hole. What's the intent with the relief hole? Was it to do surgery, or was it to get access to a vein for a catheter? So we're getting off where I think need to be with this discussion.
David.
I'll counter your argument on another species. So we'll bring horses into the mix. I have a horse with white line disease. I can do what I want on that horse because it's my own horse, but if this were a client's horse, part of it is identifying the tracks and curating out the hoof with a Dremel tool and a cutting burr. So I'm cutting on the tissue of that hoof, making a path or exploring a pathway to determine what is in there. The veterinarian may say, I don't want to understand under that horse and do it. I'm going to have you do it. So am I doing surgery on that hoof? So once you start getting too specific in types of cases, you're going to start creating some problems. I think the people that are sectioning teeth, just like what we heard here, those people have been trained, they're monitored, and if they weren't doing a good job of what they were doing, either the client would be filing a complaint with the doctor or the doctor would not allowing them to be doing it. That's a pretty advanced skill that you're just not going to take an untrained person to do. And most of those people have independently gone out and got additional training at seminars or wet labs or independent study to advance their skills and keep up with
current practices.
I get, that's a great point, and I guess as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the veterinary assistant who cuts the toenail too short and and the animal bleeds.
That's what I came up here to
Yeah.
ask you, if cutting the toenails was surgery.
Yeah, and so, well, we're on the same page, Nancy. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's not surgery, right? So, okay, well, that's, I mean, it's a good discussion. So, yeah. Yes, Jennifer.
And I think we're also forgetting that ultimately the supervising veterinarian is in charge. I would never be in a situation where I'm extracting anything. If I'm working for Dr. Sullivan and I do something I'm not supposed to, he's responsible. So we need to remember that too.
So we've had a discussion about the letter to the board, and it was brought before the board or the committee to discuss this. The board agendized this to us. So what is it that I carry back to the board tomorrow in my report?
We'd like further direction from the board.
That what I've heard is that we've discussed the issue and that we feel that the regulations that as they stand are appropriate, safe, they work for the consumers, they work for the animals, and we're comfortable with the language as it is. No. No. Okay?
Yes.
I'll add this, and I didn't include every communication I had with this veterinarian. She didn't say, you're correct, Nancy, anything bad happened in her letter, but in subsequent emails, she did cite other examples that were perhaps problematic. But what I hear, direct supervision, that is huge. I mean, that is the bottom line. And however you define extraction, like I said, this was an education, and to know that in some states you can do some things that not only in this state wouldn't be permitted, but in my mind, in any state shouldn't be permitted, baffles my mind. So while, and why in Nevada they are very prescriptive about X, and in Washington they don't even mention it, you know, there are too many issues to even consider or discuss. They're not really important. If we spend another 3 meetings adding language to define an extraction, the first thing I'd think is to what end? In the end, the way it goes in most, I'll just use the term, good practices, the person who's doing the dental work is an RVT who's licensed to do it. 2, there is direct supervision. She just doesn't take in an animal on the veterinarian's day off and do the procedure. I mean, the dog has been put under anesthesia, so there was direct supervision for that. So working according to that, the way it goes, in my experience doing relief work, is these technicians are a very select group. They're maybe not one of these 7, but they're people that, most of them anyway, in my experience, have done some advanced training, like Nancy mentioned. And I didn't know that. Technicians get more training in dentistry than veterinarians do in school, but I will tell you the dentist that I referred to earlier asked for a show of hands in the meeting. He said, how many of you who graduated after, I think he used 1990, got sufficient training in dentistry in school? And of course, nobody did. And so he says, exactly. That means you're learning it from someone on the street who didn't get any better training. So the people who are getting the training, and it's not mandatory and it's not free, are the technicians and the veterinarians who pay for their courses, assuming that's the norm, after they've got their RBT license, and then they bring it back to the practice. And probably in many circumstances, myself included, they're teaching the veterinarian things. So I don't think the problem is technicians out there going rogue, taking out teeth. I think of the 2 concerns, definition of extraction and direct supervision, if anything, there's probably a ball being dropped on the direct supervision category. Because if in fact some of the issues that she subsequently concerned occurred, and indeed a technician was going beyond their purview, there was a veterinarian who wasn't supervising appropriately. So I didn't anticipate this to be as smooth as it seems to have been. I don't know what nightmares I've been following, but are we at the point where a motion is necessary?
I think that we can have had a discussion and we're good. I can report the discussion. There's no action, so I don't think we need a motion when there's no action. Okay. So we're on to the next agenda item, which is, I believe, public comment. Items not on the agenda, inviting the public to come forward. Hearing no public comment on items not on the agenda, let us move to agenda item number 8, which is future meetings. It looks like we've got a meeting coming up on August 28th of this year. Location to be decided.
That's going to be in Sacramento.
In Sacramento. And then November 13th, 2018.
Likely in Sacramento,
Okay.
but we'll update the MDC.
Okay. Our assignment priorities, ongoing assignment priorities, are the Complaint Process Audit and Enforcement Case Outcomes Subcommittee. We will have a continuing and ongoing minimum standards for shelter medicine subcommittee. I will leave it to my esteemed colleague and successor, Dr. Pollard, to determine the composition of that subcommittee. And then I will report to you after tomorrow's meeting with the board if there are additional items or priorities for the MDC. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, 2035 may be boomeranging back around. With, like, you know, yeah, board may just want to deal with it. You know, those guys are crazy over there. Hearing none, I'd like a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. All right, meeting adjourned.
Hey,
Hey,
hey.
congratulations.